That's true. All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sean Ritenour. I'll be talking to you today about growth versus prosperity. And what the title really is about is, should we say, modern growth theory versus the Austrian economics of prosperity. I think it's a better way to think about it. Economic progress, the issue of economic progress, is one of the main topics of macroeconomics. Austrian economists and Austrian economics do not really view macroeconomics as a separate set of theories that are mysteriously unrelated to microeconomics. All of economics is related. All economic theories are the implications of human action. And so what we call micro and macro are separate, not from a theoretical perspective, but on the basis of topics. What topics do we cover? So micro is essentially a price theory. What determines prices? What causes prices to change? How do people respond to prices? What determines profits? What determines the interest rate? What determines wages, et cetera, et cetera? Macroeconomics is really about three main topics. One is the purchasing power of money, which is a general meaning of exchange, which is something that then applies throughout the entire social economic order. One other major topic is the business cycles and recession. That is a topic that you heard an excellent lecture about from Paul Swick yesterday, and I've just received information that I think we can believe that new copies of Paul Swick's book is now available at the bookstore. So if you're still wanting to get that special something for that special someone, nothing says I love you than high quality economics literature. So just keep that in mind. Christmas is coming soon. And then thirdly, economic expansion development, which is what the lecture is going to be about today. That's the third sort of main topic of macro. I mean, and I like this topic because I tend to be more positive, more upbeat. I'm sort of more the happy Austrian. Paul Swick, he talked about business cycles. What happens when things go wrong. He's sort of a little darker kind of personality. But we'll be lecturing together tomorrow on history of economic thought, so that'll be fun. But in any event, I'm going to be talking about theories of economic prosperity. And modern development economics emerged as a sort of field, if you will, as the economic development of poorer countries became an issue relevant for political plans for post-World War II reconstruction. What became known as the Third World was really a sort of a set of countries that the First World, the West, the US and its allies, and the Second World, the Soviet Union and its allies, were sort of fighting over. And as a result of that, that was part of a process that led to the development of the field of modern development economics. And as a result of a number of things. One was Keynesian optimism. There was a perception that Keynesian interventionism was working, the sort of so-called golden age of Keynesianism from 48 to 73. We found out by the early to mid-70s that the golden age was a little tarnished. It was sort of like the Sacagawea golden dollar. It's not really gold. It just rubs off a little bit, and it's just a dull metal coin. Well, that's sort of the golden age of Keynesianism, but people really thought in those terms. They thought we had solved the business cycle theory in those days, and so we can apply these principles to development issues. There was the perceived success of the Marshall Plan, supposedly rebuilding Europe after World War II. There's the development of national income statistics that seem to document economic realities about goods that are countries that are very, very wealthy and countries that are very, very poor. And so that people start naturally asking questions. With all these countries so wealthy, why are these countries still stuck in poverty? We need an economics to be able to figure that out. And also, of course, we had the creation of international aid agencies, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And those agencies fund and employ, shall we say, gobs of professional economists. That's a technical term, by the way, gobs. And as a result of all of this discussion and debate, there was the formation of the so-called gap theory, or the theory of the poverty trap, that countries are trapped in poverty because there's a gap between the amount of savings they're able to engage in an investment and the amount that's needed to get them over the hump. And so all of these things were significant in the development of the theory of modern theories of economic development. And what I'm going to do is talk through some of these modern growth models for us. And the one thing, I'm going to cut to the chase a little bit and just note that these theories of modern theories of development economics, or modern growth models, such as the Ritenour model or the solo neoclassical growth model, or even the endogenous growth model, they suffer from some of the same problems as modern macroeconomics in general. And if you're interested in reading about these problems, I would suggest some of the works by Roger Garrison. There's also an excellent essay by Philip Bogus about modern macroeconomics in light of Austrian business cycle theory. And in any event, you'll find that these modern growth models suffer from what we call excessive aggregation. They don't think in terms of human action. They think in terms of spending flows on various types of goods. They're also mostly heavily mathematical models, which has all the strengths and all the weaknesses of mathematical modeling in economics in general. They assume efficient coordination, right? So issues of resource allocation really don't come up in these modern growth models at all. And then to the extent that they do talk about changes over time, are we experiencing more prosperity over time? I would argue that they have a very superficial analysis of change over time. And what do we mean by this? Well, let's just take a look at the first model. It's called the Ritenour model. Ritenour because it was developed sort of independently by two Keynesian economists, Harrod and Domar. The Harrod here, Roy Harrod, he was actually a biographer, one of the early biographers of Keynes. And they begin with sort of the simple Keynesian cross framework. So if you ever had principles of macro or intermediate macro, you're probably familiar, been exposed to the Keynesian cross, where we have Y, national income, is simply the sum of CNI, the sum of consumption spending and investment spending. And then, if we need some help from the government, we add G to it, so C plus I plus G, the government spending. And that is then the main equation that we use, and the equation that Harrod and Domar use to try to make sense of how we can grow, right? Every good theory of economic progress should be able to explain, one, why are some countries rich now and other countries poorer now, and also explain how is it that countries that were poor, which pretty much every country was at one time, how did they become wealthy, right? Well, Harrod and Domar said, well, we can explain this on Keynesian terms. And they see that, well, if investment goes up, that's going to lead to increases in national income. And so they, as a result of their analysis, came to the conclusion that the growth rate in national income equals the ratio of the savings rate to the capital to output ratio, right? Minus depreciation, right? So of course there's always gonna be a little bit of depreciation, but as the savings rate increases, if the savings rate is higher than the capital to output ratio, that's going to result in more capital, by which they meant more capital equipment, more capital goods being used in production, and that will lead to higher rates of growth. And so the key conclusion there is that there's a positive relationship between the rate of savings and investment and the rate of growth. Now, this by itself is a statement that would be we would have sympathy with that statement if you were paying attention in Dr. Newman's lecture on capital theory and lectures on the interest rate. Yes, as we save more, if there's more real savings, that allows us to extend the capital structure, allows us to be more productive. Absolutely. A fundamental Difference, however, is for the Keynesian, investment is just I, right? It's just spending on investment goods willy-nilly. In other words, every dollar of investment spending is the same as any other dollar of investment spending. The assumption is then, if we get more investment, no matter what we're investing in, it's a good thing. Right? It's a good thing, as Martha Stewart would say. That's their key conclusion. That was Ritenour. Well, there were certain neoclassical economists that thought it was good as far as it went, but then they said, well, wait a minute. There is an optimal level of capital goods that we could have. Given a level of population, it's possible to, invest so much in capital goods that capital goods begin to have diminishing returns and even negative returns. And so what are we to do with that? Well, how do we make sense of that? We make sense of that by developing a vision of the economy as if it is a production function. And so we then developed by Robert Solow and another economist named Swan. Again, they developed this theory independently, and the neoclassical growth model is a model that models the entire economy as one single short-run production function. Right? So if you've ever had intermediate micro, this should look very familiar to you, but with a notable difference. In this production function, we have a y on the vertical axis and K on the horizontal axis. So it's not labor that is changing, it's capital that is changing. And as we increase capital, we get more output. But notice that the production constraint is y at time t is equal to a at time t times the function of capital at time t. Now this a is what's called a productivity shift factor. It is something that will affect how productive the capital is, and therefore it's often assumed to represent technology. So if there's something that's going to make the capital more productive, that'll shift the entire function up. If something happens, the capital is less productive, the function will shift down. But the entire output is dependent then on the productivity shift factor, A, and then the diminishing returns to capital. And there are diminishing returns to capital, which again makes sense. If we're holding labor constant and land constant, if we increase the amount of capital that we have to work with, that's going to boost our productivity. Productivity is going to increase, but at some point, diminishing return sets in, just like it does to every factor if the other factors are held constant. And so we get this particularly shaped production function. And so the point of the Solow model is that capital investment doesn't explain sustained economic expansion development. Doesn't explain sustained economic growth. That if we continue to do nothing but save and invest and then subsidize saving and subsidize investment like the Ritenour model implies we could do, then at some point we're going to get so much capital that we're going to reach the maximum point and we're going to be stuck there. We're going to be at some steady state and we won't be able to get any more growth in output unless we have a boost in the productivity shift factor. Right? Now, what this model predicted is that there would be a convergence then between the more developed countries and the less developed countries. That as the more developed countries save and invest and they get to the high water mark, they'll get to that high water mark and then realize, well, we don't want to save and invest in capital anymore, so we'll just sort of hang out at this plateau, this new steady state. And the other countries that aren't there yet will sort of catch up, and so there will be a convergence of growth rates and a convergence of levels of wealth. Now, it turns out, empirically, that hasn't happened yet, right? And we're going to talk about what developed after that, but before we get there, I just want to make a point. This is how they explain, then, sustainable expansion and development. The increased capital investment eventually yields a maximum output. And so if that's the case, well, what explains countries that have continual growth over time? Well, the Solow growth model implies that it requires increased technology. Technology is the key. In other words, capital can sort of jumpstart economic expansion development, but the thing that's going to keep it going over time is not even more saving and investment. It's going to be increases in technology. That's the deal. And so with the movement from the Ritenour model that became sort of popular in sort of the late 40s into the 50s, we moved from there to the neoclassical growth model of Solow and Swan. It was like late 50s, early 60s. We moved from what we could call capital fundamentalism, it's all about capital, right, to technology fundamentalism. It's all about technology. Right? Then, of course, I think it was probably the 2000 teens, we could say call it base fundamentalism. I think it was what Megan Trainor said, it's all about the base. But it's all about none of these things, really. It's about production and productivity. Technology has a role to play, but we find that saving investment does too. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that empirically we did not find the convergence of growth rates that the neoclassical growth model led economists to expect. And so what do we do with this? What are the explanations for this? Well, that then opens the door to a number of economists, including Paul Romer, to develop the endogenous growth model. The endogenous growth model says that, yes, there are diminishing returns to capital. That would limit sustained production if we didn't get something else that would help offset this. And it turns out that what offsets this is technology spillovers. Right? The diminished returns to capital is offset by increases in labor and increases in technology. As we get a boost in technology, a la the productivity shift factor, as we get continual increases in technology, we can then, in some sense, overcome the diminishing returns to capital. Now, the key assumption for endogenous growth theory is that there exist technological spillovers. In other words, if a technology is developed by one innovator or set of innovators, once that technology is made known, it can be used and copied by others. So if I invest in some production process that's using a new technology, my investment in that capital that's using the new technology is then learned from and copied from other people. And so the returns to the society is greater than my own private returns, right? So we have technology spillovers. And so the main sort of thinking about this is that the cost of invention and innovation falls as human knowledge accumulates, because the more we know, the more easier it is for more of us to know more. Right? So for instance, just a good example here is this photo here is a photo of one of the earliest snowmobiles. Charles Eliason, in the 1920s, developed the prototype of the modern snowmobile, and he didn't just come up with it from scratch. Right? He took a two-cylinder motorcycle engine that had already been invented, and he took a long sled that had already been invented, and he put it together and put long skis that had already been invented up front and used them to steer, and it was propelled with a single sort of track, already been invented. And so the invention of all these other things, all these other forms of transportation then, were just sort of put together in an innovative way to create the snowmobile. And so Romer's argument would be, well, if it wasn't for, it was the invention of the motorcycle and of the ski that made it easier for somebody to come up with the snowmobile, right? The snowmobile. It's sort of like the old, nobody knows what I'm going to talk about. You know, Reese's peanut butter cup? 2 great tastes in one candy bar, right? Well, peanut butter and chocolate didn't grow up together, right? They had to be introduced accidentally, spontaneously, one might say, and then that created this great, that happened in the 70s. I was a child then, and because I can remember this. And so you have the knowledge of peanut butter and the knowledge of chocolate, and suddenly now we have the knowledge of Reese's, and then that spawned Reese's Pieces, and the whole, candy happiness ensued. So the bottom line is as we know more, we have a larger knowledge base that makes it easier for us to innovate, and get even more production. And so what that means is then that raising the level of capital can lead to ever-increasing growth rates. Raising capital, the level of capital can lead to ever-increasing growth rates because along with capital comes technology. And with the technological spillovers, we're able to, in some sense, get increasing returns to scale as opposed to decreasing returns to capital, not scale, but capital. So that's a big deal. Now, just as the EVSI or the Ritenour model implied a savings gap, so the UN, the World Bank, IMF thought, well, we can solve the development problem by pouring money and subsidizing investment just per se. That didn't pan out. Or if we are the solo growth model, we need sustained investment. We can just start pouring money into technological innovation. We can just subsidize willy-nilly R&D. And that, especially for less developed countries, that didn't really pan out. The endogenous growth model implies that we can, if we subsidize the right things, if we subsidize U.S. institutions of promoting knowledge discovery, like research universities. Let's just pour lots of government money into research universities, and we'll all benefit significantly, especially the less developed countries. If we pour money into their research facilities and their research universities, they can benefit from technological spillovers. And all of these models, the Ritenour model, the neoclassical growth model, the endogenous growth model, have been used by interventionists to justify subsidies of one form or another. An excellent book, by the way, illustrating why these things haven't really panned out and haven't been beneficial is William Easterly's book, now I can't remember the book. It's the Quest for... It's a book that Easterly wrote, I think, in 2000 or 2002, and I can't remember it, but it's like the quest for development. I can't remember. Anyway, sorry I brought it up now, but I'm getting old. He goes through and shows empirically how subsidized loans to less developed countries, subsidized for education in less developed countries, subsidies for investment in general have not panned out, have not helped lift less developed countries out of poverty. The Elusive Quest for Growth, that's the name of the book, The Elusive Quest for Growth. Excellent book, I recommend it. From somebody who's not an Austrian. He's a, shall we say, the best type of neoclassical economist. But in any event, there we are. And then the next question to raise is, these things haven't panned out, they haven't been beneficial, they haven't resulted in solving the mystery of growth, the mystery of development. What are we to make of all of this? Well, the reason these models are, say, less than satisfactory is because they succumb, as I said, to a lot of the same problems of modern macro. The aggregation in these models led to focusing on increasing inputs that are perceived as homogeneous, right? So the I in Keynesian is just the big I. Any dollar of investment is as good as any other, right? In the neoclassical growth model, it's K, right? K is a homogeneous blob of capital. And so just the more money you spend in capital, the more productive we are, the more output that we get. Or A, productivity shift factor. We get more technology. What is more technology? What are units of technology? If we just invest in the right amount of technology, we'll get, sustainable growth. Economics doesn't work that way, right? Economics is about how individual humans allocate the goods that they're able to obtain. And they have to do that in a world that is with a lot of other people that are doing the same thing. There's no such thing as I. There's no such thing as K. No human, spends I. Right? They save and invest in particular goods. No entrepreneur hires K. Right? They employ particular capital goods, spending particular amounts of savings in particular ways to producing not Q or Y, but producing particular units of particular types of goods as output. Right? So that's a problem. These models are all mathematical models. And as I note there, the mathematical models are good at describing equilibrium conditions and comparative statics, right? This is this equilibrium condition, we change some number, and this is the new equilibrium condition. Right? These models are not good at all describing the market process that moves us from one situation to another situation. And they're not suitable at all describing the continuously changing real market economy. We don't live in a world of statics. We don't even live in this moment of equilibrium, and then now we're in this one, and now we're in this one, and now we're in this one. That's not the way we live. Time is a flux where things are constantly, continually changing, and the mathematics don't capture that element of the activity. As Mises says, there is no action in equilibrium. There is no action in equilibrium. And Hal Varian, who wrote one of the most popular intermediate micro texts and one of the most popular mathematically oriented graduate level texts, he is an honest mathematical economist. He says, we don't care about the process. We don't care. We actually are only cared about equilibrium states. We don't care about the process that moves us from one equilibrium to the next. But the economy is all about the movement. Right? It's all about the movement of markets as they adjust to people's changes in preferences and other things. Changes in the quantity of resources, changes in the population, changes in technology and knowledge. In these models, then, economic efficiency becomes sort of a single technical engineering problem of constrained maximization. They're just constrained maximization problems. The economic order is modeled as a unified singled entity, a la one firm that we're trying to maximize output in the short run. But in fact, the nation is not the economic subject. Right? There is no nation that acts producing all of its output. What is called the national economy is actually a complex economic order comprised of many individuals making decisions to improve their own economy. These models assume known preferences. They just assume that the preferences of the people are what they are, and that the producers know what these preferences are. That's the key. They assume that producers and the humans in the reality, they model humans as agents that know everything. They have perfect information. And they have a superficial consideration of time, right? Their consideration of time is, okay, y at time t, and then, wait for it, y at t plus 1. Capital at k at time t versus capital at t plus 1, right? Well, you're talking about, yes, two different time periods, absolutely. They're two different discrete time periods, but again, that really is just talking about, here is the first equilibrium point, here's the second equilibrium point. Let's just see what the difference is. That's all it's about. What is the difference? There's no intention, there's no effort to really understand what goes on in the market process that could move us from a situation where we're more poor to a situation where we're more wealthy. Right? And this is important too, because in most conventional modern economics, what we call efficient is a situation of a static Pareto optimal equilibrium, where every person has made every possible mutually beneficial exchange. The prices all adjust to prices where the price equals the sum of the factors of production plus a little interest, where profits and losses go away because there's no more uncertainty. We move from one equilibrium construct to the next, and that's considered efficient, right? So it gives us the impression that we can simply engage in the right subsidies. We subsidize individual determinants, and we can enjoy then progress. If we subsidize education, or we subsidize capital equipment accumulation in general, or if we subsidize so-called human capital development. Or we could subsidize maybe research and development willy-nilly. Then somehow these individual subsidies to the individual sectors is somehow all going to result in a good outcome. National income accounting also contributes to this bias of planning for development because it focuses on inputs and growth in GDP, right? So you estimate the national income is GDP, one number, and then we focus on the inputs, the C and the I and the G spending, and that yields a higher GDP. It's kind of, there are conventional economists that actually are like those economists that Tom Wood spoke of, that we are not them, the people that think the economy is one number, GDP, but there are a lot of economists that work in a lot of universities, that work for a lot of government agencies, that really do think that the economy is basically GDP and GDP is basically the economy. And that, of course, then sets up a bias for the right type of government spending, levels of government spending, lowering interest rates to stimulate investment. We know that that's going to cause trouble. We've already talked about that. And so we have these biases baked in, even the way of trying to measure the economy that leads us down the garden path. And so ultimately, the modern growth economics misses some of the most important elements of economic progress. They miss what's going on with changes in product characteristics. In other words, how do goods become of better quality? How do goods become a higher quality? If we're just measuring a good as a good, how do we measure growth in input or growth in output if we compare, say, an early iPhone to a more recent smartphone? I mean, how do we do that, right? You can't. It's one phone, it's one output. You can't capture that. You certainly can't capture that scientifically with GDP. You can capture it artistically, right, but not scientifically. Or you can attempt to capture it artistically. Also, this view of economic growth in a way misses important elements of improvements in the methods of production. I mean, focusing on GDP, I'm talking about here. You tend to focus on the magnitude of inputs versus the magnitude of outputs. You tend to look and not focus on how our production techniques changing that allow us to be more productive. In short, modern development economics, modern growth models tend to ignore important principles that are very relevant for actual economic progress, and therefore relevant for a theory of progress that's in the praxeological literature. And there's actually been quite a bit of literature written about this. You can go back to the foundational literature in all of economics, to the works of Mises, Human Action and Socialism, and other essays and books that he's written. Bumbaverk's Capital and Interest has a significant section that helps explain aspects of economic progress. Carl Menger, actually, in Principles of Economics and other works, actually also comment and sort of lay the economic principles, the foundational principles that helps explain development. And then Murray Rothbard, of course, in Man, Economy, and State, and other essays. And then there's a host of other economists that you should be aware of. Victor Espinosa is a contemporary economist that's doing good work in this area. Randy Holcomb, Jesus Huerta de Soto, Sudha Shenoy, who is an Indian economist, economic historian who's passed, sadly. She has written some excellent works from a historical perspective of economic history, talking about using good theory to explain the historical process. And so these are all works that I encourage you to take a look at if you want to go farther. There's also, an important work that I guess I don't have on that list. Ben Powell's book, Out of Poverty, came out in 2014. Ben Powell's book, Out of Poverty, is excellent work as well. So in any event, what does this literature tell us? What does the Austrian literature tell us? Well, first, it recognizes that economic progress in economic prosperity is a historical process. It's not something that happens in a test tube. It's something that happens in the real economy over time, and hence it takes time. Now, what that means is, if we want to understand it, we have to approach it similarly to how we approach business cycle theory. Right? A general theory explaining economic progress has to be in some sense holistic, meaning not that we look at the economy as a whole. It means, what I mean is we have to bring together many strands of economic theory for us to explain the process. And what that means then, it's also an effort at analysis as well as synthesis, right? We have to identify and explain the various processes, the various vehicles that contribute to economic prosperity. That's the analysis part. But then we also have to explain why and how all of these processes work together to allow us to enjoy prosperity. That's the synthesis part, right? And so economic progress occurs when the sum of economic profits are greater than the sum of economic losses. That's when progress occurs. If you look at, throughout the economic order, as there are more entrepreneurs reaping more profits than there are entrepreneurs reaping losses, then we are enjoying economic progress. Now, what's interesting here is that the Austrians recognize that because the future is uncertain, losses will in fact occur. Economic progress is not a situation where everybody's reaping profits. Right? We live in a profit and loss economy. And so there's always going to be losses because the future is uncertain, because we don't know exactly how things are going to pan out. And some people are going to invest wrongly. But we have economic progress when the profits are greater in sum than the losses. And so even though we know that losses will occur, nevertheless, the vehicles of economic progress move us to a future in which people are able to enjoy more and better goods they desire over time. And this is a process that Huerta de Soto refers to as dynamic efficiency. Jesus Huerta de Soto, the Spanish economist, says he can contrast dynamic efficiency with the sort of conventional static efficiency. And even in the conventional literature, they talk about dynamic efficiency, but for them, that just means moving from one static equilibrium point to another more positive static equilibrium point in the future. That's not what Austrians think of as dynamic efficiency. It's a system where, yes, we are improving in our economic welfare because profits are greater than losses, but we recognize there are still going to be losses. Right? We're not moving from one Pareto optimal situation to another necessarily. So what are these vehicles of prosperity we've been talking about? Well, things you've already learned about. There's a market division of labor that Jonathan Newman lectured about. And the main point here, of course, is that specializing according to efficiency and cooperative action is more efficient and productive than isolated action of self-sufficient individuals. That's the law of association. And so what that means is that's as people are able to participate in the market division of labor, they're able to be more productive. And hence that contributes to more prosperity. The division of labor is something that the modern growth theory almost completely leaves out. I think Douglas North, if you want to call him a modern growth theorist, he recognizes the importance of the division of labor. I think there's one other economist, a mainstream economist that does, who's an unknown mainstream economist. I found one book, and it's a huge, thick book where he tries to mathematize the entire division of labor. But beyond that, the main growth models just completely ignore it. The other vehicle of prosperity, the second one, is capital accumulation. Right? Capital accumulation, and that was something that Patrick Newman talked about. So you've already heard about that, right? That saving and investment allows for widening and deepening the capital structure, which increases our productivity, right? Increases the productivity of labor, increases the productivity of land. So as we save more, we invest more, we have more capital with which to work, we're more productive. Thirdly, the third vehicle is technological improvement. Technological improvement, or improvements in technology. Technological improvement is when the capital goods technology is simply a way of doing things. It's a way of doing things, it's knowledge of doing things. And technology is always bound up in capital goods. It's always bound up in capital goods. And so here we have different ways we can mix something, right? If we want to make a cake or cookies or whatever, we could use a fork, we could use a whisk, we could use a handheld mixer, we could use a standing mixer, or we could use that big industrial strength mixer clear at the right side of the slide. Those are all different types of capital goods that embody different types of technology. And as we improve in technology, you know, the standing mixer is quite frankly more productive than a fork. Right? It takes less labor than a fork, so your labor can be more productive. So technological improvement. And then also a third or a fourth, shall we say, vehicle is entrepreneurship, something that Peter Klein talked about. All of the production in the economic order requires coordination of plans determined by entrepreneurial judgment. Entrepreneurs have to decide what we're going to produce, how we're going to produce it. They have to make the decision. Capital, in order for profits to be greater than the sum of losses, capital must be invested wisely rather than wasted. Right? So prosperity is not the result of just investment willy-nilly. It's the result of investment in the right things. Production decisions in the present are based on a forecast of uncertain future market conditions. And if the producer forecasts incorrectly, he'll use his capital to produce something he'll not be able to sell at a price needed to cover his costs. And that does not contribute to prosperity. That makes him a loser. Right? And that's no way to make an economy great again. Right? So entrepreneurs are important to allocate savings and capital appropriately to best serve other people. But entrepreneurs also drive economic progress through innovation. They're the ones that have an incentive to find new and better ways to produce things and to find new and better products that will satisfy people's ends even more than the current state of goods. Entrepreneurship also is notably absent from modern growth models, but it's something that is very at the heart of Austrian theory of economic prosperity. And to understand how important the entrepreneur is, the entrepreneur makes judgments at many margins, right? They have to decide at the level of the margin of the product. What type of product do they want to produce? What quality of product do people want? What location, where do we want to locate the production of the product? Where do we want to sell the product? What's the scale of our operation? Should we have a big factory or a small shop factory? How soon should the product be available? Can we wait and take a longer time to produce it, or do we have to produce it right now? What's the anticipated price buyers are going to be willing to pay for our product? Right? In terms of capital investment, they have to decide how capital intensive does my production process need to be, given what I want to produce and sell. How durable should the capital goods be? Should it be the high dollar industrial strength mixer, or a stand-up mixer that maybe is not going to be as durable? How specific should the capital be? The capital goods, should it be very specific? It's only good for this one good that I'm producing, or is it a capital good that I can use to produce a number of different goods? How much capital should I use versus labor or land? Technology, and the right amount of technology that's always embodied in capital goods, that technology has to be allocated well as well, right? The entrepreneur has to decide, what production techniques do I use? What technology do I use? What type of technology in the capital goods do I use? How much should I spend on research and development if I want to do that? Those are all entrepreneurial judgments. So the entrepreneur is something that's at the very heart of economic progress and progress to economic prosperity. And again, something that's left almost completely out of conventional modern growth models. Like the only really economist, well, not the only one, but the mainstream economist that talked about it the most was William Baumol. And he did not, to my knowledge, talk about it in terms of these modern growth models. So he's sort of an outlier in that respect. Finally, note that one cannot neatly separate the sources of economic progress from one another and find a single key that explains all economic growth, right? In other words, it's not all about market division of labor. It's not all about capital. It's not all about technology. It's not even all about entrepreneurship. A highly developed division of labor would be impossible without the accumulation and use of capital goods. Likewise, the entrepreneur must invest real capital in the production process. At the same time, capital per se never guarantees economic progress either, because it must be widely utilized. And if a producer errs in his market forecasts, he can reap losses like we've already talked about. Similarly, for technology to be productive, it must be bound up in actual capital goods. So even the use of technology requires saving and investment. Right? So the bottom line is that economic progress yielding increased prosperity is the happy consequence of a highly developed division of labor taking advantage of an increasing capital stock, embodying better technology wisely invested by entrepreneurs. And this has implications that enable economic progress. We need social institutions, a private property, and sound money. We only specialize in producing certain things if we can trade our excess supply with other people. So we have to be able to engage in voluntary exchange, which implies we have to own our products. People have an incentive to save and invest in capital only if they have the insurance that they can keep the positive rewards from their investment. Likewise, people have an incentive to research and development and better utilize technology if they are able to keep the proceeds and the benefits of their research and of their technology. And entrepreneurs can only calculate profit and loss if their calculations are guided by market prices that actually reflect the subjective valuations of the people, as Dr. Salerno has already taught us. So that's why we need sound money. With those two institutions, that allows these vehicles of prosperity, the division of labor, capital accumulation, technology, and entrepreneurship, to all work together to provide us to real economic prosperity. And that is a theory of economic prosperity that's more robust and therefore more relevant to the real prosperity we want to enjoy, rather than modern abstract growth models that tell us some things but are sadly lacking in the most important things. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session. And I want to thank the Mises Institute for inviting me and the donors for making it possible. So I was asked to talk about the political economy of policing, and first I think I should explain what that is. So, what it is. So the political economy part, basically by that I mean the economic analysis of the institutions through which policing is provided. So this is going to be a comparative institutional analysis, mainly between what normies think of when they think of policing. Right? This is your state law enforcement agents, but I do include that, but not only them, but also anything non-state as well that is done with the purpose of protecting persons or enforcing property rights. So I'm taking a pretty broad view of what I mean by policing as such. The primary part, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, or maybe that's an overstatement, but the light by which I see everything else is through economic calculation. So police departments, state-provided police, they are bureaucracies, and the defining feature of bureaucracies is that they are unable to engage in economic calculation. So thinking about Dr. Salerno's lecture about economic calculation under socialism, right, the issue here, right, even if you have markets for final goods, so we have prices for outputs, I have a little dollar sign there. The main problem, as you recall, is that you don't have market prices for inputs, right? If the state or the people or the Central Planning Board has control of all productive resources, there's no private property in them, therefore there's no exchange and no market prices that develop for them in terms of money. And so, right, the central planner is in the dark, like, oh, we don't know whether we're allocating resources to more highly valued uses. And I think a bureaucracy is somewhat of the inverse of this issue, where bureaucracies operating in an otherwise market economy, that they do have meaningful market prices for many of the inputs they acquire. Right? Government bureaucracies have to go into markets to acquire goods, and those have meaningful market price. So they do have a measure of their accounting costs in terms of this meaningful cardinal unit. But they don't have a price for their outputs. That's why I have a question mark there, if you can see that in the back. So think about a police department. They don't have a measure of marginal revenue. They are mainly taxpayer funded. You call up the police, maybe they come and do something. Maybe it's valuable, maybe not. But regardless, there's not a market price for it. So likewise, we don't know, as a police bureaucracy, whether we are allocating resources to more highly valued uses. I want to say a little bit more about the prices of inputs. So many of the inputs that police departments purchase, guns and cars and handcuffs, these have civilian uses. Most of them, anyway, or maybe they all do. So these have meaningful market prices. They have to bid them away from other uses. For certain types of inputs like labor, this can get a little bit fuzzier, a little bit more nuanced. So certain kinds of labor that's used in the public sector has a pretty close voluntary sector counterpart. So if we think of something like janitorial, custodian services, it's pretty much the same whether you're cleaning a government building or a private business. And so the price that governments pay for that is going to, say, probably fairly accurately reflect its opportunity cost as valued by entrepreneurs operating in the voluntary sector. the more specific these inputs are to government outputs. So when we're talking about police officers, I mean, some of the things they do, probably demanded by private markets, but there's not as close of a private sector counterpart like there is for, say, a bookkeeper or a custodian. And so in this way, we have less of a good idea of how much a police officer should be paid. And I put should in scare quotes because I don't mean like how much do they deserve. It's more in terms of what's their marginal revenue product? What do they contribute to the value of the output produced by the bureaucracy? But again, the bureaucracy doesn't have any marginal revenue product because they don't have any marginal revenue. Their revenue comes from taxation, not consumers voluntarily demonstrating that they prefer the output of the bureaucracy compared to the alternative uses of their money. And so this point will come relevant later in the lecture when I talk about police unions. And because we don't know how much they should be paid in terms of the discounted marginal revenue product, there's more room for chicanery and fudging in terms of whether they're overpaid, but we can't objectively say they're overpaid because there's no real market for them. So this, I like this graph. I use this a lot. It's widely applicable. You can kind of put whatever you want, label these curves however you want. But what I'm trying to communicate here, if we think of the x-axis as you move along it, you're buying more policing, which hopefully reduces the amount of crime or other bad things happening. The problem for the bureaucracy is that, I mean, while this cost of crime prevention, right, might be defined for them as they buy more inputs, they can engage in meaningful cost accounting in terms of market prices for inputs, as I just mentioned. This downward sloping curve, you could also describe, instead of the cost of crime, the benefits of crime abatement. This is not defined. There is some point beyond which expending more resources to reduce crime is not worth it. Consumers would rather allocate resources otherwise. There's some level of crime people would be willing to tolerate. And yeah, let's spend our money elsewhere. But yeah, to reiterate, the big problem for bureaucracies is that they don't know. So that could be an issue of, yeah, let's have more resources to reduce crime more, but if the goal is to allocate resources to their most highly valued uses, the bureaucracy is in the dark in determining where this optimal point is. So this is the big epistemological issue, I'd say, in policing, that police bureaucracies can't engage in profit and loss calculation. So what do they do instead? I'd say the main ways in which they try to evaluate their performance is based on data they collect incidentally. Things like reported crime, arrests, or clearance rates. Clearance rates being mainly, if there's a reported crime, was it cleared by an arrest? Though there are other ways in which, if the suspect dies or something, these are ways in which the FBI considers crimes to be cleared. But, I mean, you can see these aren't really any substitute for profit and loss calculation, right? I mean, thinking about reported crime, I mean, I guess when crime goes down, police officers would like to take credit, like, yes, we're doing a good job. If it goes up, if they say, yeah, it's our fault, but it's an argument for why we need more resources to bring crime down, right? So it's like, is this a good measure of police performance? Probably, there's a lot of issues. Is more arrests better? I mean, this is, an output, but arrests are expensive, right? It's not always, the best use of resources to make an arrest whenever a crime occurs. So, of course, there are issues with this in terms of using them as a proxy for police performance. I would say the best social scientific research in terms of attempting to deal with this question, because it was Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues at the Indiana University. where they, the question they were considering at the time, what was popular, maybe it still is, in terms of municipal governance was consolidation, where why do we have all these suburbs, independent municipalities have their own police departments? Why don't we have one big one so we don't duplicate services? So they were attempting to shed some light on this question in Indianapolis. They looked at similar townships, those that were getting served by the police department, or the Indianapolis Police Department, those that had their own independent neighborhood police departments. They surveyed, as valuable as surveys are, they surveyed residents there. How do they feel about the policing services they received? And how much did these police departments spend per person? And so while you can tell some things from this, like if people liked it better and it was cheaper, then you say, okay, maybe this is a more efficient scale at which to organize municipal policing. But if they liked it better, but it was more expensive, then it's ambiguous. It's very much not a substitute for actual markets in terms of consumers being able to express what level of service they want and how much they're willing to pay for it. So even though I consider that probably some of the best, it's still very limited in how well it can evaluate the quality of policing. By contrast, when we're talking about the voluntary sector, when there's competitive markets, these institutions that allow for economic calculation, private property, competition, money prices, economic calculation is possible. We can talk about this at the individual level in terms of psychic profit. If your home is your castle, and say you want to invest in certain security devices, you build a moat around your castle, you fill it with alligators, you put in a drawbridge. All of these things have market prices. So you can say, here's how much it costs to build my moat, and here's the psychic benefit at a subjective level. I prefer the services I receive from these security devices compared to alternative uses of my money. So you can do that at an individual level. You can also do it commercially. That is, if you are running a business and you either purchase security from a specialized firm or provide it in-house, you have money prices for those costs of whatever security device or personnel you're purchasing, and then you can compare it to a benefit that's measured in monetary terms. Might be additional revenue from having greater security, losses prevented, or higher capital values. And so you can meaningfully, and I'm not saying this can do this perfectly, I'll give some illustrations, but you can tell whether these investments are worth doing. So one illustration of this, taking this from Fox Business, this screenshot we have over in Philadelphia, there was a gas station having problems with patrons being held at gunpoint and robbed while they're pumping gas, which isn't good for business. So the gas station hires this guy. He's got a rifle. He's in an attempt to make people feel safer, that they won't be held up at gunpoint while they're pumping gas. And so the gas station owner, acting as an entrepreneur, he can measure the costs of hiring this guy, having him around, cost of ammo, or if you have to discharge weapons and all these other costs associated with it, and then can compare, okay, what was revenue like before we hired this guy versus afterwards, and determine, was this guy worth hiring? Is the revenue generated by his presence greater than what it costs to bid his labor away from other uses? And so here, economic calculation for this security is possible. In addition to whether economic calculation is possible, there's other institutional differences between policing provided by bureaucracies and policing provided in the voluntary sector that I think are important and relevant. So one is that government policing primarily takes place in the public domain, or public property, if you prefer that. Those areas which nominally everybody owns or nobody owns, but they're not privately traded, so there's no capital value to them, to the government streets and sidewalks, these other areas to which everybody's supposed to have access. Another difference that I think is quite important is that government police are constrained in terms of the rules they can enforce and how they can enforce them. Excuse me. So an issue with bureaucracies is that they don't face the same constraints as private actors, right? If they're taxpayer funded. So lest they become tyrannical, you want to constrain them in some way. But this has costs of its own, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So now, I guess I want to emphasize this issue of that there's all these kinds of trade-offs. I mean, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is a list that I want to talk about today, where there's competing values and without the institutions that allow consumers to express their preferences and what they're willing to pay for, policing provided by bureaucracies will be in the dark. And so the implication is that if you find problems with being, say, in this convenience and dignity and security trade-off, having more of one comes at the cost of the other, and bureaucracies will be in the dark in finding that optimal trade-off according to what consumers want. So I'll talk about each of these. So the first one I just mentioned, convenience and dignity and security, trade-offs between constitutional constraints and security, and whether to use force and how much force to use when you decide, it's time to take the gloves off. Various enforcement policies, and then getting into some issues with police unions about their wages and working conditions and the trade-offs associated with those. So regarding this convenience and dignity and security, one example, maybe you've had experience with them, perhaps on your way here, is with the Transportation Security Administration, where they now give scalp massages and ASMR. And I don't know what this, I haven't experienced this myself. I don't know what security function this serves, but it must be crucial. So the problem here is when you have a monopoly in the provision of airline security, right? I mean, they want to, presumably secure airplanes, but is there any, how do they navigate this trade-off, right? Let's say it's probably easier being in charge of this bureaucracy to err on the side of, say, security or even security theater, and who cares about convenience or your dignity? Say, if this were instead a more incentive-aligned arrangement, I would think, is, say, if the airlines themselves were in charge of securing their own airplanes, right? On the one hand, they would want to make things as convenient as possible. Presumably, flyers would prefer that, all else held constant, to avoid the head massage and taking off the shoes and all of that business, unless these were security measures that, because they have hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of capital goods at stake, right? So they do want to protect those. So they want to find this optimal trade-off between convenience and security as evaluated by consumers. And if you have the institutions of competition and voluntary trades that allow consumers to choose where they'd like to be along this trade-off, then to use that Hayekian phrase, this competition becomes this discovery procedure by which entrepreneurs are able to determine where along this trade-off that consumers want to be. Another example of this, probably can talk about all kinds of examples. I like this one. It's in a Kroger, this grocery store over in Georgia. So in this picture, it is displaying within this Kroger an additional barrier walls around certain items that seem to be more prone to theft. So there's one entry and one exit, and hopefully in the attempt to prevent shrinkage, or as they use the term, losses. And it says some customers upset over changes at a Kroger, like saying, I feel like I'm being treated like a criminal at this Kroger. I don't like it. So yeah, there's a cost to this. So the manager of Kroger, this Kroger, making an entrepreneurial decision has to determine whether this is worth doing. So again, it's not going to be, economic calculation doesn't allow for omniscience. They won't know, okay, precisely how many consumers decided, okay, I'm going to go to a different grocery store because I just find this indignity unacceptable. But they can have a rough idea, like what was revenue like before we had this barrier? What's it like afterwards? How much less shrinkage are we experiencing? And we can measure these things in dollar terms. So again, they can determine whether this is worth doing. And also, again, there's this constraint. They don't want to be so onerous that, more people decide to leave and they lose more revenue than the dollar value of losses they prevent. Very similar example, this is in Baltimore. You go to certain neighborhoods, there's everything you buy is going to be behind some bullet-resistant device. But again, here, pretty much the same issue, right? There's this trade-off between convenience and security, and entrepreneurs are going to want to find where that optimal trade-off is as evaluated by consumers, and it's only through competition that they're able to do this. So moving on to this issue of constitutional restrictions. So Mises, in his great book, Bureaucracy, and after this lecture, go buy a copy. It's only about 100 pages. It's everyone should read. It's a wonderful book. He states in here, if one assigns to the authorities the power to imprison or even to kill people, one must restrict and clearly circumscribe this power. The law determines under what conditions the judge should have the right and the duty to sentence and the policeman to fire his gun. So for Mises, since bureaucracies aren't constrained by profit and loss, they have to be constrained in other ways. And so the main way is like having all these rules that they have to follow. Follow the rules. And hopefully things work out well because they don't have these same constraints. But this has costs of its own. I like how Randy Barnett, the legal scholar in his book, The Structure of Liberty, describes this what he calls the dilemma of vulnerability. And this is related to the point about government policing primarily taking place in the public domain, in which he states that a society that includes extensive public property holdings is faced with what might be called a dilemma of vulnerability. Since governments enjoy privileges denied their citizens and are subject to few of the economic constraints of private institutions, their citizens are forever vulnerable to governmental tyranny. So that's why you have these constitutional restrictions on what police can do to you, right? At least they're not supposed to, and at least in the American case. Like, come arrest you because they just think you're up to no good. They don't like the cut of your jib or however the phrase goes. They have to have probable cause that you have committed a crime or reasonable suspicion that you're about to commit a crime in order to detain you. So this is to restrict them lest they become a governmental tyranny. But the dilemma of vulnerability is the more that the government police are constrained, now your vulnerability moves to private criminals that are more open to engage in chicanery because the government police are restrained. So that's the trade-off. This is the dilemma of vulnerability. They're becoming more vulnerable to government police or private criminals. So how to navigate this trade-off? So regarding this issue of order maintenance, either in the public domain or on private property, as I mentioned, government police are constrained in their ability to maintain order in the public domain. In the public domain, basically, if you are, unless you're, say, on probation and parole and restricted from certain areas, you have access, the same access as everyone else, where this is not the case on private property. Private property owners are able to exclude people that, if they don't like the cut of your jib or think you're up to no good, they don't have to provide a reason, right? So laws against certain disorderly activities, these things that, in certain areas, like where I am near Asheville, North Carolina, you do see a lot of these activities in the public domain. A lot of vagrancy and loitering and panhandling and public intoxication. But various courts, in considering enforcement of these rules, have voided them for vagueness, right? If things like a police officer sees this woman waving, is she soliciting for prostitution, or is she trying to hail a cab? It's ambiguous, right? And so that is one reason why these laws, like, we don't want this governmental tyranny, but does that allow for disorderly conduct in the public domain? So an illustration of kind of an alternative to this that I find interesting are these guys. So these are, I love their uniforms. These are the Beatles of Burlington Arcade. The Burlington Arcade is this upscale shopping area in London. And these guys are considered one of the oldest private security services that still exists. So they provide security for this area. And they enforce certain rules that would be considered unconstitutional if an American police officer were to enforce them. So a couple examples of this are, within the Burlington Arcade, whistling is prohibited because at some point in time, this was a code used among pickpockets to communicate with one another. So like, okay, no whistling to prevent pickpocketing. Another prohibition is against making clucking noises because ladies of the night in the apartments above the shops, they'd advertise their services by making these clucking noises, I guess. Cluck, cluck. So this is advertised to men in a shop and like, hey, we're available. Of course, this might not be good if you want to keeping up appearances in your upscale shopping area. So you can't make clucking noises. Of course, prohibiting whistling or making clucking noises as a municipal code in the United States, that would be illegal. So the real constraint here, instead of constitutional constraints on First Amendment purposes, et cetera, instead what constrains private property owners is competition, right? They don't want to have rules that are so onerous. If people really want to make clucking noises, right, an entrepreneur will want to serve that end. So it's competition that restricts heavy-handed rule enforcement on private property. Somewhat related issue, this question whether to use force or how much force to use. So depicted here, this is again in Philadelphia. This is at a Philadelphia Starbucks a few years ago. There are two individuals being arrested in this picture. So what happened was they said they were there to make a real estate deal, and they were waiting, and I think one of them asked to use the restroom, and they were told, well, you either buy something or leave, and I guess they did neither. And so the manager of the Starbucks called the police to get them to leave, and but this kind of went viral. This created a bad publicity for Starbucks. And they're like, man, look at this. And create a bunch of fallout. I guess several thousand Starbucks locations were closed for a day or half day of training to prevent this from happening again. The Starbucks CEO met with these individuals. I think he might have created a scholarship for young entrepreneurs in their name. So this was very costly for Starbucks, that they made an entrepreneurial error in their use of force. Even though it was government agents acting on their behalf, still operating in this context where profit and loss calculation is possible, they're able to determine that, yes, this was an entrepreneurial error, that they should have tolerated this nuisance rather than, and to be clear, they are in their rights to enforce this, but it might not be the profit-maximizing decision. But they're able to tell because they are in an environment in which profit and loss calculation is possible. And what I really like about this particular story is that economic calculation can tell you when you're overcorrecting. So a few years later, you see this headline: Starbucks to close 5 Seattle stores over safety concerns. That is they overcorrected. They became too tolerant of certain nuisances, of, say, certain individuals shooting up drugs in the bathrooms and these kinds of things that made employees and customers feel unsafe. And so they ended up closing these stores. So again, economic calculation allowed them to tell, here, we're either being too heavy-handed with our enforcement, or we're not being heavy-handed enough. Also, the lack of economic calculation leads to an inability to determine whether what's optimal policy. So one example of this is whether to engage in hot pursuit, where some police departments really restrict this, right? And you can understand why. I mean, the benefits of limiting hot pursuit, right? They reduce the liability of police officers, because, yeah, when they chase, they might get into car accidents. The person being chased might get into car accidents. This isn't good for public safety. So the idea is, if we don't chase under certain circumstances, we're going to reduce the likelihood of a car crash. Along with this, that if we don't chase them, then they're not going to drive recklessly. Of course, this comes at a cost, right? There are certain individuals who know, if I'm not going to be chased, then maybe I will be more likely to break traffic laws. Or, and I guess along with that, I borrow this phrase, deaths of exuberance, from Steve Saylor. After during the Summer of Love, he observed that a lot more traffic deaths happen. It seems like after one of these big incidents involving an officer-involved death, that police officers around the country tend to withdraw a bit. Like, I don't want to end up on the news. And so they engaged in less traffic enforcement. That his argument is that, well, this led to these, this is the inverse of deaths of despair, right? Deaths of exuberance, like, yeah, we're going to have fun, we're going to drive, maybe drinking and driving and having some fun. And this leads to deaths of exuberance. There's also fewer entertaining police chase videos. That's another cost, when there are fewer police chases. So how do we know what the optimal policy decision is? It sounds grammatically funny, but we can't know. Not when we have road socialism. That's the main issue here, is that when economic calculation isn't applied to roads, then we don't know the optimal enforcement rules. I want to talk about police unions a bit. Very interesting phenomenon. So, especially after 2020, it seems like when I was getting more calls from media outlets, because I was writing about police unions and things they're up to. And one of the things that police unions get for their members, as unions do, is not only, I guess you could consider this part of better wages and working conditions. One of these working conditions being job security. That is, if you have rules that make it harder to punish police officers for misconduct, this increases their job security. This is a substitute for higher wages. That is, all else held constant, greater job security means you can pay lower wages. It's similar to like college professors and the institution of tenure. If you had two similar colleges, similar positions, if one offers professors tenure and one doesn't, well, one seems more attractive. So the one that doesn't is going to have to offer higher wages to compensate for that lesser job security. And interesting enough, we have pretty clear illustrations of this in Chicago. So around a decade ago, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Chicago Police Union, they negotiated, in lieu of pay increases, since the city was on harder fiscal times, like, okay, instead of pay increases, give us greater job protections. And the city's negotiators decided to do that. And then, a few years later, there was problems with misconduct. The city created a police accountability task force. I believe Lori Lightfoot was on this task force. And they had a number of recommendations, and one of the recommendations is, hey, part of the reason why you have this misconduct problem is because of these job protections that make it harder to punish police officers. And so we recommend getting rid of those, that this will improve or reduce the amount of police misconduct. And the Fraternal Order of Police President said, yes, we'd be willing to do that, but bring the checkbook. It's like, pay us more, and yes, we will negotiate fewer job protections. So I'd say this is a pretty clear illustration that these are substitutes, wages and job security. And I mean, also part of this trade-off is, well, if you give police officers more protections, that might mean lower taxes, at least in the short run. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Somebody should do accounting of whether the payouts that the city has to pay when they get sued from this misconduct, whether, yeah, should have just paid more wages beforehand. Because they have, as you imagine, it seems to be, yeah, truly, I mean, people talk about, oh, it's just a few bad apples, but there are the bad apples who are responsible for the big judgments against the city. Another thing I think would be interesting, because it seems like a lot of the police reformers seem to assume that, oh yeah, just get rid of these things, it'll be costless, not thinking, what are the knock-on effects if you reduce the pay of police officers by reducing their protections? What will be the consequence of that? They don't ask people who want to reform police, like, are you actually willing to pay for it? Would you? I guess I'd like to ask those really interested in reforming police in this way, like, how much would you be willing to pay for less misconduct? But nobody asked, not to my knowledge. I think another, as a side point, an interesting political economy issue is, taxpayers aren't this homogeneous group. That is, I imagine that the people responsible for the majority of the taxes, wealthier individuals, aren't the ones who tend to experience the police misconduct. They might say, yeah, lower my taxes, who cares? Whereas it tends to fall on poorer individuals who have more interactions with the police and pay a smaller portion of the taxes. So I mean, this suggests to me that maybe a city such as Chicago might be too big of a scale on which to provide policing in such a way that everyone is satisfied. Another related issue to this, so talked about this, greater protections potentially leading to more misconduct. I mean, the main argument in favor of giving police officers greater protections, it's not, oh, so we can pay them less. It's that if they don't have these protections, then they're going to engage in de-policing. So the idea with de-policing is, I mean, this goes by various names. After, see the Michael Brown case a number of years ago, they called it the Ferguson effect. That is, police just withdrawing, doing the least amount they can. Like, if I just hang out in my car and only maybe respond to calls for service when I have to, then there's less of a chance that I'll get in trouble. So the argument for these protections, like qualified immunity, is that if police are doing a good faith effort in their job, but say accidentally end up hurting someone, that, hey, they won't be civilly liable for this. And this is to encourage them to be proactive, go prevent crime rather than shirking, as I would otherwise call de-policing. Why are they able to engage in shirking? Well, they are a taxpayer-funded bureaucracy. There's not competition from another service provider who will cause them to lose business by not engaging in shirking. So again, a firm in competition with other firms, they're going to pay a cost if they engage in shirking. They want to minimize liability while also adequately protecting customers. So they don't have the same flexibility, I'd say, in terms of engaging in de-policing. They are going to be replaced. So I've got a few minutes. I'll engage in some self-promotion. Go find this paper in the journal Public Choice and go download it, pump up the numbers, cite it. Except, yeah, I'm like, is anybody still interested in this issue? So this was a paper about the defund movement. It seems like nobody talks about this. We want to think the people who are in support of it want to pretend it never happened. So, yeah, or does anybody remember this phenomenon? So after, the Summer of Love, it seemed like a lot of city leadership wanted to make it seem like they were doing something, right? So the TLDR of this paper is that, so these politicians, usually large blue cities, wanted to seem like they were doing something about police misconduct, but they're kind of constrained in how they can reform police. Like, if we want to ban chokeholds or these other procedures, this is actually hard to do because this would be considered a change in wages and working conditions, and then you have to engage in binding arbitration with the police union. So it's hard to do. In most cases where you see something like banning chokeholds or different police tactics tends to be at the state level because they don't have these contracts with municipal police departments, so they're less constrained in that way. So what they ended up doing, like, okay, we can cut their budgets. Of course, like, you do not touch the wages of current police officers, but what you can cut is future hiring. So that's where most of the cuts happened, is in terms of hiring police. But in this environment of the Summer of Love and its aftermath, I mean, a lot of these cities experienced like record high murders that year. And it's really hard as a politician in the face of this environment to like remain committed to like, no, we're not hiring more police. What ended up happening is pretty much all of these cities ended up not only after whatever cuts they made going back to where they were, but more than that. So it was, kind of a short flash in the pan, but that's kind of the story there, a story of police union constraints, wanting to make it seem like you're doing something and not really, well, I guess they did something. To conclude, even though we tend to think of something like policing as maybe being conducive to a bureaucratic management, that it's like, okay, somebody breaks a law, we have these rules, you go arrest them, and so on and so forth. But it's really more complicated than that in terms of what consumer preferences are. And as I mentioned, there's all kinds of trade-offs in the provision of security. And when security is provided through the bureaucratic means, due to the lack of economic calculation, the bureaucrats are in the dark. I mean, if their goal were to allocate resources to their most highly valued uses. And so reform can't solve these problems. You're just going to end up at a different place on the trade-off and still be in the dark regarding what consumers would prefer in terms of where to be along that trade-off. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to questions. One? Who's lucky? I don't know.
Have you thought of free market, private solutions to many of the problems that you've outlined with government policing?
So, question is, have I outlined private solutions to these problems? So, I think, as I hinted at during the lecture, I think a lot of the problem is the public domain. So, I don't want to have like too simplistic of a story, just like, privatize the streets and everything. But I'd say that's where a lot of the crime occurs, is areas in which, where you truly have this public goods problem. People talk about policing being this public good that's going to be underprovided if markets are providing it. And so that's why you need the government to step in. I don't think a public goods problem is really inherent to any good. It's more, what are the property rights associated with this good? When you have this expansive public domain in which nobody owns it, nobody captures the benefits from improving it, then yeah, there's less of an incentive. So by having this expansive public domain, that does make security a public good in that sense. And various other things, these differences we talk about with private property, where it seems, well, I mean, as I mentioned, when you restrict police, like you have to wait until somebody commits a crime until you can do anything about it. Like this isn't conducive to crime prevention, right? Whereas private entities can exclude certain parties. And I think, yeah, to the extent you can expand that private property and the incentives with it, and economic calculation, I'd say that you'd see less crime. So in a way, say at a more micro level, you already can see it, right? In the United States, crime is very concentrated, right? It's a handful of counties in which half the murders happen. There's a lot of it. I think of where my grandmother lived in Berthold, North Dakota. They don't have any police there. There's no cops. Everybody knows everybody. It's I mean, I guess if you could probably call the county sheriff if you need some, but generally it's like, I don't know, is that, it's anarchy there, So, yeah, I'd say on a small scale, where you have private property, private enforcement, you already see, in a way, this operating to some extent. Oh, thank you.
could everybody please take their seats? Could everybody please take their seats, please and thank you.
Okay, willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to this afternoon lecture on a very interesting topic, the economic and social consequences of inflation. This is a topic that has been discussed for a very long time at Mises University. There are tons of lectures online by very good professors about this. And it's very hard to come up with something new. Luckily, this is not an advanced session, but a session for all attendees. So I'm supposed to cover the basics. So there's no shame in just repeating what all the other professors said before me. And partly I will do that. Nonetheless, I will try to at least offer somewhat of an alternative perspective on the same or similar problems that have been discussed in previous lectures. In particular, I want to provide somewhat of an alternative view on the problem of business cycles, or as I would call it, the distortion of the macroeconomic arbitrage process that happens because of inflation. Let us dive in to the plan for this lecture. I first want to give a brief introduction about what we are talking about when we talk about inflation. I want to give you an idea of what the magnitude of the problem is. And then I go into what I consider to be, on a very broad level, the main economic consequence of inflation, which is the distortion of the macroeconomic arbitrage process. I will explain what that means. In the third part of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about inequality and social mobility that is affected by inflation. And in the end, I want to talk about some further effects, some further implications. I like to give a reference for all the interested and highly motivated students here. If you want to go a little bit deeper into the material, this would be one of my publications that covers some elements of this talk. It's a joint publication with Professor Gunther Schnabel, who used to be at the University of Leipzig, is now working in Cologne for a wealth management firm. We wrote this article actually in 2019. The working paper version is published with the IFO Institute in Munich in 2020. And then it took 4 years until the journal that we submitted the paper to decided actually inflation is an interesting topic. So this is an example of how a roundabout process of production is not more efficient, economically speaking. The paper is still the same as the version we sent initially in 2020, but in the meantime there was high official inflation, and so the editor thought, well, it's about time that we get this published. So they did, and we were of course very happy about this. All right, let's go right into the introduction. So when we talk about inflation, we have to talk about central banks, who are the institutions behind inflation. You've heard this probably before, it's just a refresher. So we can think of central banks as being legal monopolists in the production of base money, or M0, which is formally defined as cash money in circulation and bank reserves. So this is relevant for inflation, but it's not the most relevant monetary aggregate. Now, the larger monetary aggregates, M1, M2, M3, are much more important. In particular, M1 seems to be important. M1 is what the layperson would consider to be money. It's all of the money available in the economy that is ready to be spent directly on consumption, investments, and whatever. So it's cash money in circulation. This is the element that is also included in M0. And it's money on regular bank accounts, demand deposits. Okay? And those are only indirectly controlled by central banks, we could say. So there's no direct control of M1 by central banks, but through various political measures, central banks influence M1. You've heard about this certainly in the lecture by David Howden on fractional reserve banking. So, for example, there are legal reserve requirements. To be honest, they are not very important, but for completeness sake, we put them in there. In principle, they could be used in order to influence the money stock. There are interest rate policies, very important. There are open market operations, very important. There are unconventional asset purchase programs that have become very important in the past decade or so. So through all of these measures, central banks try to influence the money stock, and they officially try to bring about an inflation target of 2%. This is the primary monetary policy goal. So whatever central banks do, they primarily do it to keep inflation, officially measured inflation, around 2%. So inflation is institutionalized in our system. So that's the big takeaway here. Of course, the obvious question that we could ask now is, how do we measure inflation? I went into this question in some depth in the advanced session this morning. I won't go as deep here, but let me just say that, as Dr. Zwick alluded to yesterday in his lecture on Austrian business cycle theory, there is an old definition of inflation. The inflation in the classical sense of the word just refers to an increase in the money stock. This, incidentally, from the vantage point of measuring inflation, is also the only really meaningful or objectively measurable type of inflation, right? This is something we could, in fact, objectively measure. How much does the money supply, the money stock, increase year on year? This is not what most economists mean when they talk about inflation. When they talk about inflation, they mean some increase in average prices. Money prices increase on average, then we have inflation. The questions that have to be raised then is, of course, what prices do we take into consideration? What kind of average do we calculate? There are different averages to be calculated. There are different index numbers we could use. There are different weights we could assign to the individual prices. And all of these are questions that we cannot answer objectively. There's no objectively true answer as to what the most meaningful average would be, what the right weighting scheme is, and so on. The underlying question we ask in inflation measurement is, how much more money do people need in order to preserve their standard of living? How much more nominal income do they need in order to have the same real income? That is the underlying question. And there is no way of objectively answering it, because real income, welfare, standard of living is something fundamentally subjective, affected by all kinds of aspects that we do not control. So there is no, the bottom line is there is no objective rate of inflation to be calculated. Nonetheless, it has been declared a policy target. And this, on many accounts, is problematic. And I want to give you very briefly some empirical data that could be seen as suggestive evidence that there might be something problematic about our official inflation measures. First of all, let's see how official inflation turned out in France and Germany, my two favorite countries, the country I'm from and the country I live in. So this is the official HICP consumer price inflation rate in Germany and France, together with the target of 2%. It danced around the target. If you calculate the average, you see it has been at 2%. Mission accomplished, great. The data in the US looks a little different. The volatility is a little higher for interesting reasons, I think. On average, it's a bit above 2%, so the American economy on that measure at least is a bit more inflationary. But overall, it is close to 2%. In both cases, you see the recent upswing in inflation rates during the COVID-19 pandemic, on the aftermath of it. And now what is really interesting is to look at how much inflation in the classical sense was needed in order to bring about this, on average, 2% price inflation rate. So by how much did the money stock have to grow, the money stock M1, in order to get to these results? This is the euro area. You see the money stock M1 since the introduction of the euro plotted as an index. So the initial value is normalized to 100. And then you see over time how this money stock increased, and you see up to the peak during the COVID pandemic, it increased by a factor of more than 6. So the money stock, all of the money in the European economy that is ready to be spent on goods and services increased within a time frame of 25 years by a factor of more than 6. This is quite something. In particular, if you compare that to real economic growth. This is real GDP growth, officially measured. So by comparison, it was non-existent. And if you make the calculations, you find that there has been an excess money growth above real economic growth of 6.8% per year. So we could consider this to be the monetary overhang, or the extra money that is not absorbed by real economic growth that could potentially bring about inflation. It's 6.8% per year. Officially measured inflation on average is 2%. So this is suggestive evidence that something else must be going on. You have to ask, where does all the money go? Where does it pump up prices, if not in consumer goods markets? Just for completeness sake, the picture from the US. This looks shocking. This massive increase during the COVID pandemic. This is due to a change in the definition that the Fed used. If we take that out, it looks more like this. And we have excess money growth in the US economy of, on average, 5.6% per year. So on average, every year, the money stock M1 in the US economy grew by 5.6% more than the real economy. So same problem, we would have to ask, where does all the money go? Is it just lying somewhere on bank accounts or under someone's pillow, not being spent on anything? Probably not. It is spent somewhere, and it has effects, economic effects and social effects that we want to dive into now. The main economic effect. This does not seem to be the updated version of my slides. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Oh God. I hope this would not happen. Let me check what I have on here. Well, okay, we have to do without this graphical representation that I prepared. This is very unfortunate. Just bear with me. So we go from here. So the first main economic effect of inflation is a distortion of the macroeconomic arbitrage process. Let me, before I dive into the elements on this slide, just briefly explain what I mean by arbitrage. So there are different definitions of arbitrage. There is an arbitrage in the broad sense of the word that just refers to choosing between different options, very generally, choosing between different options by taking into considerations the costs and the benefits. This is arbitrage in the broad sense. We immediately see, okay, this happens everywhere in human affairs and everywhere in the economy. Then there is a narrower version of arbitrage. Arbitrage, in the narrow sense of the word, refers just to the exploitation of price differences. And if we think about this narrower definition of arbitrage, we realize that virtually all economic actions can be considered as arbitrage. Right? Any investment decision, any production decision, even any consumption decision is, in essence, an attempt to exploit price differences. Take consumption decisions. When you decide to buy a good for consumption, you exploit a price difference, an indirect price difference, namely the difference between the actual market price you have to pay and your reservation price that is in your head, the maximum price you are willing to pay for that good. Under uncertainty, you have not full information about the quality and so on. If your reservation price is below the market price, you go ahead, you buy. You exploit this price difference. And like any arbitrage action, by doing so, you make this arbitrage opportunity disappear. By the law of diminishing marginal utility, your reservation price will decrease. Eventually, it will fall below the market price you have to pay for the good, and then you stop consuming. Take production. Production is also arbitrage. The price difference you try to exploit as a producer or as an entrepreneur is the price difference between inputs and outputs. As long as the inputs put together are cheaper than the output you produce, you gain a revenue. You make a profit in the accounting sense of the word, or even an entrepreneurial profit. So this is arbitrage very clearly. And now you can think about the entire macroeconomy as being a process of arbitrage. And the aspect that influences this process of arbitrage mostly is the interest rate. The interest rate, which is a policy tool for central banks to influence the money stock and bring about price inflation, is crucial in this arbitrage process. So now we go here onto the elements of this slide. When we think about inflation through conventional monetary policy, we can think of it as being very similar to a type of price control, a control of interest rates, a type of price ceiling. And when you think about the effects, the economic effects of price controls or price ceilings in particular, there are a couple of them, a couple of central effects. The first one being excess demand. If you have a price ceiling below the market clearing price, you have excess demand or you have a shortage. Think about rent controls. Rents are pushed down, you have more demand than supply, so there is a shortage, not enough apartments or houses to be rented. The next effect would be black market activity. Right? If you, by law, rule out mutually beneficial exchange opportunities, people will try to find a way around them. And there are black markets. The reason why we have flourishing black markets for rental apartments in European cities is rent control. And then there's discrimination going on the part of the sellers against the buyers. If there are many buyers willing to buy, the sellers can choose along other dimensions than the willingness to pay. They might decide not to rent out to students because they party too much, or they do not rent out to gay couples because they don't like them. Yeah, so discrimination becomes easier when you have price controls. Now, the interesting thing about inflation and conventional monetary policy is that you can find analogies. You can find all of these effects as well in the case of interest rate controls. So take excess demand and shortages. Of course, there is not a shortage in terms of money because money is printed. The shortage emerges on the markets for the real factors of production. Dr. Zwick emphasized this yesterday in his lecture on the business cycle. Black market activity, well, there's not really black market activity going on when it comes to lending money to willing borrowers. So we would have to be very creative to find this. But when you think about the third aspect, discrimination of buyers by sellers, you find a very clear analogy. Once central banks have pushed it too far to the territory where interest rates for refinancing operations of commercial banks are even below zero, clearly discrimination has to happen. Because if you just economically think about this, negative interest rate, could this work? Could this ever work? It can't. If you have negative interest rates that are just there for everyone, for every willing borrower, well, you would take out as much money as you can. The money stock would explode and we would have hyperinflation in no time. So the system couldn't work with negative interest rates for everyone. So what has to happen in an environment where interest rates are even pushed below zero is clearly discrimination. Central banks have to discriminate and decide who gets some money, and they have to cap the amount of credit that is lended out. So what happens, for example, in Europe is the so-called taxonomy. Certain investments are treated preferentially. They get lower interest rates. So banks that lend to businesses in sectors that are considered to be environmentally friendly or sustainable enjoy negative, sometimes or very low, and sometimes even negative interest rates in their refinancing operations with the central bank. Okay, so this is how the central banks discriminate among investors and control investment projects in the economy through the printing press. More broadly, inflation and interest rate policies distort the implicit time market and intertemporal decisions. There's an interesting debate going on about whether low interest rate policies actually change the underlying time preference schedule of actors. Some economists have argued to this effect that it actually increases time preference. People become more short-term oriented. It shifts the time preference schedule. And others have argued, well, no, the interest rate change just leads to a shift along the time preference schedule. No matter what it is, it changes the actions people take. And it changes their intertemporal decision-making. It also hampers the discovery process or the discovery procedure that Dr. Fegley referred to in his lecture just before this one, of the market process. And it hampers the efficient allocation of resources. So now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not the updated version of my slides, so the graphical representation is not here. But let me just briefly explain what this allocation mechanism is all about and how it is related to the interest rate. You can think of the economy as being a range of different production projects or investment opportunities with different profit rates. And any entrepreneur engaged in any line of production has, of course, special knowledge about the circumstances in this line of production in these areas, and knows pretty well what the profit rate is that he or she can expect. The interest rate in an unhampered market would just be a reflection of the average profit rate all over the economy. In the hypothetical situation of an evenly rotating economy or of a general equilibrium situation, all of the profit rates and the interest rate would just coincide. Yeah? Because if they don't, there are arbitrage opportunities. If they do not coincide, there are arbitrage opportunities. There are ways to improve the situation. Okay, an entrepreneur who's engaged in some production process where he or she makes 5% profits per year and sees that the interest rate on the credit markets, on the financial markets, is 10% per year, has an incentive just to de-invest, take out the funds, lend the money to willing borrowers on the financial markets. He makes 10% by borrowing out his funds, more than he would make in his respective investment project. By this arbitrage action, the entrepreneur brings about two things: price adjustments in his line of production, as well as a price adjustment on the financial market in terms of the interest rate. If this entrepreneur gives his funds, borrows out his funds over the financial markets, he increases the supply of credit, thus pushing down the interest rate. By de-investing, taking out money from his production projects, he will lead to an increase, he will push towards an increase of the profit rate. Why? Because there are price adjustments happening on both sides of the production process, the inputs as well as the outputs. By de-investing, the demand for the inputs is reduced. Reduced demand means prices fall, the inputs become cheaper. Less output is produced, the supply of the output decreases. Decrease in supply means an increase in price for the outputs. So we have falling prices for the input factors, increasing prices for the output factors, which means an increase in the profit rate. Yeah, and the tendency is towards an equilibration of the profit rate, which now increases. It was low before, it now increases. And the interest rate on the financial market, which initially was high, it now falls because there's a higher supply of credit. Yeah, so there is this equilibration. Once central banks intervene into this process and push interest rates artificially low, they hamper this allocation mechanism. It is, from an economic vantage point, desirable that money is de-invested in unprofitable projects and transferred over the financial markets or directly into other ventures that are more profitable. From the point of view of the economy, this is something desirable because more value is created in the lines of production that generate higher profits. Once central banks intervene, they push the interest rate below its natural level, its market rate. Then maybe an entrepreneur that is engaged in a relatively unprofitable line of production might even be tempted to borrow more money and invest. Let's say in this situation, 5% is the profit rate. The central bank pushes the market rate of interest to 3 or 2%. Then the entrepreneur sees this, compares the two prices, 5% profit rate, 2% interest. It's actually worthwhile to take out more money and invest in this line of research that, in the grand scheme of things, is relatively unprofitable. So, and this is true for all the lines of production in the economy. So everyone has an incentive to take out more credit and invest into more production, expand production. And the effect is now that input prices tend to be pushed upwards everywhere. Costs increase disproportionately, and then eventually you might have the problem of the business cycle, you have liquidation crises, and so on. But most importantly, you stop the redirection of monetary funds away from unprofitable projects into profitable projects, and you reduce overall the profit rate in the economy. And this in the long term can decrease economic growth. And what you also see here, and I'm very sorry that the graphical representation of this is not on the slides, but what you recognize here is also how monetary policy and inflation brings about relative price effects. In this case, input prices are pushed up. There are real scarcities emerging because the real factors of production are fundamentally scarce, as opposed to money that can just be printed. Prices are pushed up for these real factors of production, and the prices for the output, including consumer prices, are not necessarily pushed up to the same extent. So we have an overproportionate effect on the side of the factors of production and assets and capital goods and so on, and a less pronounced effect on the side of the finished consumer products. So this is one reason, of course, why you would want to look elsewhere than just in consumer goods and services, which is what official inflation measurement does. They only look at consumer goods and prices. Another example that illustrates this relative price effect that can emerge when it comes to conventional monetary policy is here. I mentioned asset prices are often affected disproportionately. Well, we can very clearly see this in real estate markets and housing markets. These are housing prices from France and Germany. I showed the official price inflation rates earlier. When you plot them as an index against the house price inflation in these two countries, you see an interesting disproportional effect in real estate. So real estate prices, housing prices in France in particular have increased massively when you compare that to consumer prices. In Germany, they have increased to a lesser extent for a very long time. During the housing bubble in Southern Europe, house prices in Germany remained actually quite stable, below official consumer price inflation. And then after the crisis, they caught up, and now they are also significantly higher, or they have, over the entire period, increased significantly more than consumer prices. So there are many different reasons that come into play here. Central bank monetary policy is not the only one. There are other types of regulations which make housing more expensive and so on. But you can clearly see that this has to do something with monetary policy and the monetary system in particular. When you consider the timing of these spikes here, when you look at France, the increase in housing prices starts with the introduction of the euro. It ends with the financial crisis. This is a speculative bubble that is obviously fueled by monetary inflation, by the expansion of the money stock. Right? Think about the arbitrage process, the allocation process that I described earlier in an unhampered economy. Monetary capital is taken out somewhere to be invested elsewhere where it's more profitable. This always leads to a balancing effect. The profit rates in the unprofitable sector will increase, make it accordingly more attractive afterwards to invest there. The profit rates in the other sector will be pushed down. In cases where you have artificially low interest rates, it's attractive to invest more everywhere. You don't have this reallocation mechanism. You just have more monetary capital available, more money to be invested available without anywhere it being taken out. So you don't have this balancing effect. You just have more investment going on. And this is what makes significant or strong speculative bubbles possible in the first place, because you don't have this balancing effect. You just have more monetary capital available without it being taken out of other investment endeavors. Okay, so let us now move on to the third section of the presentation on inequality and social mobility. Right? The main reason why we have to think about potential effects in terms of inequality is precisely because monetary inflation, the expansion of the money stock, has relative price effects. As just explained, in terms of inputs and outputs, in terms of asset prices and consumer prices, there are relative price effects, and relative price effects always go hand in hand with distributive effects. Now the question is, in what direction does the distribution or the redistribution work? It could potentially decrease inequality, it could potentially increase inequality, and there is an ongoing debate about where exactly it goes. But there are good reasons to believe that overall inflation increases inequalities. And there are four main channels or four main types of redistribution that occur in the economy. The first one would be from the private sector to the public sector. In the publication I referenced at the beginning of this session, we show this. Price inflation rates in government-provided public goods are overproportionate, measured by government revenue. Government revenue increases overproportionately as compared to the consumer price index, showing that the government receives overproportionately more funds over time, which is a way to argue that whatever the government does, it has become more expensive. Yeah? So government-provided public goods become more expensive, and this is not even adjusting for quality. Yeah? We have a distribution from relatively poor to relatively wealthy strata of the economy, which is essentially a no-brainer how this might work. If we have overproportionate asset price inflation as illustrated by housing prices, we can see the same for stocks and other types of assets, including precious metals, including land, including cryptocurrencies and so on. You find all kinds of assets that increase in price overproportionately. This has a direct impact on the spread between poor and wealthy strata of the economy. Those who already own assets benefit from overproportionate asset price inflation. Those strata of the economy that do not already have assets try to buy them. They are disenfranchised. For them, it becomes harder to acquire the assets, and so on. So there is a redistribution from relatively poor to relatively wealthy strata of the economy because of overproportionate price inflation. There is a redistribution from labor income to capital income and capital gains in particular. Again, one reason is overproportionate asset price inflation. Lots of capital gains are made here. There is another reason why labor income suffers in an inflationary economic environment. And the reason here is a change in investment behavior. Once you have an economy where overproportionate asset price inflation is something that you can count on. Of course, there are corrections. Every once in a while, bubbles pop. But you can pretty much count on asset prices increasing over time, overproportionately. In such an environment, it becomes much more interesting to invest in a way that we could qualify as speculative. Right? Instead of engaging in productive investments where you buy inputs to produce outputs, you buy certain outputs, certain assets, houses, other assets, and count on the prices increasing and making a profit from the price increase. So this would be called a speculative investment. We know as Misesians that every action is speculative, but yeah, this is what I mean. Speculative investment is not engaged in real production. It buys what already exists and counts on price changes to make a profit for this very thing that is bought. And these investments, speculative investments, become more attractive in an inflationary economy. Productive investments become less attractive. The consequence of this is that we have less capital accumulation, less production of capital goods. We have less capital that can be paired with labor. Hence, labor income suffers. It is not increasing as fast as it would otherwise. There are even good reasons to believe, and we show this in the paper, that labor income diminishes. Lastly, there is a redistribution going on from young generations to older generations, and this can be understood once we realize that younger generations or younger people tend to be more dependent on labor income, and they tend to be those that have not accumulated as much capital or assets yet. So if the other redistribution channels are correct, from poor to wealthy, from labor to capital income, then overproportionately young generations suffer from it because they are the ones depending on labor income more than older generations, and they have less or smaller portfolios in terms of assets acquired, typically. Unless they inherit, then that's, of course, not the case. But generally speaking, there is a redistribution that is intergenerational from young to old. And overproportionate asset price inflation finally undermines social mobility as it drives up the wealth to income ratio. Right? I mean, these channels that I just described are already sufficient to see the problem. If labor income is damaged, relatively speaking, increases less than it would otherwise increase, then in particular young generations who depend on labor income, or people with lesser qualifications, low-skilled workers who typically depend more on labor income, they suffer from this. For them it becomes harder to catch up and to build up wealth for the future. And the summary statistic that is often used for this is the wealth to income ratio. Here you have it again for France and Germany, and you can see in this picture how closely this correlates with housing prices. Yeah? So the wealth to income ratio in France in the 90s has been around 3.5, 3.6, meaning that overall wealth in the French society, in the French economy, was in terms of money 3.6 times as big as the annual income of the French population. Yeah, so all the assets put together were worth 3.6 times as much as the annual income of the French population. Now introduce the euro, housing prices move up, other asset prices move up, stocks as well, and land and so on. The wealth to income ratio is pushed up as the monetary value of all assets, of all wealth in the French society increases over proportionately compared to income. So it is pushed to above 6 until the Great Recession, and then there's a slight correction or a stop in the increase, and it eventually continues to increase. It is now at around 7. So wealth is 7 times as big as annual income in the French population. So what are the implications of this? Take a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Imagine an average guy, not an average Joe, more an average Pierre, who tries to build up wealth in France. He has no wealth so far. He earns an average income, and he saves 10% of his income every year to build up wealth. We abstract from all other sort of effects that might come into play. Average income, 10% saving rate. how many years would Pierre need in order to attain the average level of wealth in the French society? Well, it would be 36 years if we are in the 90s, and it is 70 years today. So the time required under otherwise equal conditions to reach, with an average income, the average wealth level in France has doubled. Instead of 36 years, it's 70 years today. And in Germany, we have similar developments. In the US too, but let me tell you that the situation is slightly better in the US. The wealth-to-income ratio is still relatively low if you compare that to countries like France, like Germany, like Japan, or other European countries like Spain, where it is even higher than in France. It has nothing to do with the overall standard of living of the society. The wealth-to-income ratio is just a relative measure. What's the value, the monetary value of wealth? What is the income of the people? And income is what is needed in order to build up wealth and to climb up the wealth ladder. If income overall is relatively small compared to wealth, then you have a hard time climbing up the ladder. In the US, it's currently around a bit higher than 5, or approaching 6. It's not 7 as in France today. So with this, I stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have them, just come up, and I see what I can do.
Okay, everyone, if we could just take our seats, please. So we could take our seats. We've got one more talk, and then you're home free until tomorrow. But well, I'm honored. Oh, I gotta. If the talk's not good, you could always take your nap during, right? Yeah. Okay, so. I'm delighted to begin. I'd like to. I'm really glad I'm able to give this talk. It's called a Rothbardian analysis of the Constitution. All right. So, I usually, as hopefully you know by now, I like to start off all my presentations basically discussing, well, what is the presentation going to be about? So, what is the presentation about, and why should you care, right? Okay, we think of the Constitution as a libertarian document, right? The Constitution of the United States is the governing document. It tells us how the federal government is supposed to operate, what it can do, what it can't do. And libertarians and conservatives often take a lot of pride in the Constitution, at least the Constitution, they say, as it was designed or as it was intended for. They say that, well, the Constitution promotes limited government. It promotes small government. Might not be anarchy or anarcho-capitalism, as some people here might prefer, but it would be closer to minarchism, let's say, or the night watchman state. The powers of the federal government under the Constitution are quite limited, and through checks and balances, we would have a country that can't engage in many interventions. So the story goes, and what I want to basically argue is that sorta. It's only through a very strategic interpretation of the Constitution that we get that. And even then, that interpretation can only take us so far. In reality, Murray Rothbard argued that the Constitution is thoroughly crony, okay? I also argued that, but the Constitution is thoroughly crony, and it was designed to provide special privileges to interest groups. So what do I mean by cronyism, or what do various scholars and economists mean by cronyism? Well, what we really mean is it's just policies that benefit special interests, these groups with a vested interest in something, a specific policy, at the expense of the public. The free market benefits people overall. It tends to benefit people overall, where people are better off. But government intervention benefits one group of people at the expense of another group of people, right? This is what Rothbard argued in Conceived in Liberty, the 5th volume of Conceived in Liberty. And this is also what I argue in my book, Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America. So what I basically want to go through here is I want to explain this. I only have 45 minutes, so I can only go through so much. There's a lot to talk about. I could spend a whole lecture itself on the Constitutional Convention or on the ratification of the Constitution or the policies passed after the Constitution. I want to try to get a sort of a broad, let's say, sample of all of these topics. So what I'm going to talk about, building on Murray Rothbard, is the first thing I'm going to discuss is saying that the Federalists pushed for a constitutional convention to get cronyism. Right? The Federalists were seen as the nation's founders. I want to talk about how the term federalism is actually not the best term to describe them. It's far more accurate to call them nationalists. These so-called anti-federalists, the much maligned anti-federalists of Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, George Mason, George Clinton, and so on, those are actually the true federalists once we understand what federalism means. But the Federalists pushed for a constitutional convention to get cronyism, which they're unable to get through the existing government system known as the Articles of Confederation that I'm going to talk about. Okay, that was the first step. Well, then the second step is at said Constitutional Convention, the Federalists created a governing document that could provide cronyism. It was designed to facilitate special interest policies. That was the whole purpose. That was the motivation. Of course, you could cloak your cronyism in public interest rhetoric, right? Because no one ever says, vote for me, I'm going to enrich myself at your expense. They say, vote for me, I'm going to promote prosperity and all that good stuff, blah, 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 blah. All right, so that's the second step, or that's the second part. And then the final step, or the third part, is Federalists enacted cronyism in the 1790s, okay? largely under the Washington and Adams administrations, and this was through largely through Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, right? And of course his associates in the Adams administration later on when he was no longer Secretary of the Treasury. But we'll talk about what he ended up doing at the end of the 1790s. So basically, it's crony, it's crony, it's crony, right? That's the idea. So that's the general theme of the talk. Okay, so Rothbard on the Constitution, right? Because we're trying to give a Rothbardian analysis of the Constitution. So what Rothbard argues is that, he says, quote, "The Constitution was put across against the wishes of the majority of the public. And the Constitution makers were interested not in general rules for the benefit of all, but in pushing through measures," right? So we're going to talk about these measures, but he was saying it's not designed to benefit everybody. It's designed to benefit one group of people over the expense of other people. So what were some of these measures? Protective tariffs. We spoke about that yesterday. Opening up of export markets. You basically develop a strong army and navy to force countries to start trading with the United States under certain conditions, whether or not they want to. Repayment of public debt at far above market price to benefit speculators who purchased it on the cheap. Expanded bank credit for privileged groups. Public works, such as subsidies to transportation companies, which would benefit the transportation companies, benefit people who bought land, and so on, for one set of people at the expense of another. Rothbard wrote this in a great essay. If you haven't read it, it's called The Myth of Neutral Taxation. This came out in about 1981. But so this is his general description of the Constitution, and I think it's actually quite accurate, right? When you really look at the motivations, it pains me to say it, but this is what was the rationale behind the Constitution. Okay, step one, the Constitutional Convention of 1787, all right? So if you've taken a high school, United States history class, you'll learn about how a bunch of founding fathers, they got together in Philadelphia. It was in the sweltering heat. They even closed the windows to make sure no one could hear. They didn't have AC, so they're working hard, and they got to iron out this document, toiling under sweat, the great founding fathers, right? So the ostensible reason was, this Constitutional Convention was created to discuss legal amendments to the Articles of Confederation. All right. The Articles of Confederation was the existing government of the United States. It was established in 1781, and it lasted until about 1789. We'll be talking a little bit about the structure of the Articles. It was really a states' rights system. And a lot of people say, oh, well, life under the Articles was terrible. It was awful. I mean, Rothbard said, Articles were great. Right? They weren't perfect, but they were much better than a lot of governments, past and present. The strongest feature was that all the states had to agree to any particular intervention, and the government did not have the power to tax. Right? So it's like, okay, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Now, this Constitutional Convention was dominated by big government federalists. Of course, big government's a relative term, but these were people who thought that the federal government should be stronger. They called themselves Federalists. So we'll talk about later, and I said earlier, it's more accurate to call them nationalists. They wanted a strong national government. They wanted weak states, okay? So who were some of these people? I got a list here. I also got pictures. I got evidence. All right, so we'll start with Pennsylvania. Right? It was sort of the source of the problem, so I might argue. You have Robert Morris. Robert Morris was a Philadelphia merchant. He was a co-owner of Willing and Morris. This is a prominent mercantile house. He was extremely influential in the Revolutionary War, very pro-cronyism, and he ended up later becoming a senator of Pennsylvania. Right? Some people would even say he was like a merchant prince, so to speak. You have Gouverneur Morris, no relation. He was a prominent landowner from New York, though he later moved to Philadelphia, and he was very influential in the actual drafting of the Constitution. And then you had James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who was Robert Morris's, basically his like right-hand man in terms of various legal dealings. He was his lawyer, he was his legal expert, and he ended up sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1790s. All right, so this is a picture of Robert Morris. you've got from New York, Alexander Hamilton. I'm sure you've heard of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, he was a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and he was General George Washington's aide-de-camp, so sort of his main advisor, and he was a prominent mercantilist theoretician. So he kind of looked down upon Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and free market economics. He said, look, just as the great Jean-Baptiste Colbert of Louis XIV made France great, we can make America great. Again, I guess. But so he said, well, we need high tariffs, we need central banking, we need all sorts of interventions we'll talk about. Coming from Virginia, you had James Madison and George Washington. James Madison was a politician and a plantation owner. Okay, he was very important in government. You had George Washington. He was a former commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. He was also a prominent plantation owner, okay? And so this is a picture of James Madison. And then you have from South Carolina, a lot of people don't know this, but South Carolina was a big stronghold of federalism. You had Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, right, who was a wealthy plantation owner. This, of course, isn't all of the prominent Federalists at the convention, and there was a smattering of, let's call them what has been called anti-Federalists, but this is just a good sample, and you can see how all these people, I've mentioned some of their backgrounds. Okay, they might be interested in certain types of policies. If they're a merchant, they might want cheap credit from a bank. If they're a landowner, they might favor land policies that benefit land speculation, and so on. Okay, so anyway, the whole gang gets together, right? And they're going to discuss legal amendments to the Articles of Confederation. All right. In reality, the Federalists secretly wanted to create an entirely new government, right? They couldn't say that, though, publicly, because then they never would have been able to go there, right? They had to really keep this on the down low, right? As what people say these days, right? So this was illegal. This was not sanctioned by the existing Articles of Confederation's amendment procedure, where basically Congress had to ratify, Congress had to approve the amendment, and then each of the state legislatures had to approve the amendments. Instead of having the state legislatures approve the amendments, right, which is a key part of the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention declared that only 9 out of 13 state conventions had to ratify the Constitution. Entirely new, these entirely new bodies. And they were very explicit about this because they knew that the state legislatures would shoot this plan down. And they knew they couldn't get it through all the state legislatures. So they said, well, we're just going to go with 3/4. Right, good enough, basically. And this objectively is a coup, right? As Rothbard said it, he said it was a bloodless coup d'etat, right? When people illegally take over a government. And a lot of times we say that, well, it's only a coup when the bad guys take over. But I mean, this is readily admitted by mainstream historians. For anyone interested, there's a huge book that came out about 10 years ago by Michael J. Klarman, I believe he's a professor at Harvard. It's called The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution, right? It's a coup, right? They illegally created a government and they supplanted the prior government, right? So this is just something that needs to be emphasized. Okay, so what do they do at the convention? Well, they're going to create the Constitution. So the infrastructure of the new government is as follows, right? You have a bicameral legislature. So you have an upper house and a lower house. And of course, we know that as the Senate is the upper house and the House of Representatives is the lower body. You have an executive leader and you have a supreme judiciary. All right, this was different than the Articles of Confederation, which only had a unicameral legislature, right? That's all, okay? What's also important about the Constitution is the elected politicians had no term limits and they served for long terms. And in fact, federal judges automatically had life tenure unless they did, quote unquote, bad behavior or something like that. This was different than the Articles. I think one of the best features of the Articles was that each congressman was annually elected by the state legislatures, and they could only serve for 3 out of 6 consecutive years. It was like a form of term limits. And the idea was you did not want to create an entrenched oligarchy of politicians and bureaucrats, right? Which is a huge problem we face now, right? The Articles of Confederation embraced what was known as rotation in office, right? We can only dream for that, something like that now. Okay, so we're gonna talk about, say, what these branches can do and all the other features of the Constitution. But when I talk about these three branches, we mention these three branches, what's often sort of brought up is that, well, there's a separation of powers, okay? We learned this in our history class. You got the executive branch. You can check Congress and the judiciary, and then judiciary can do the same thing, and Congress can do all that. And so this is what constrains the government, right? You have the separation of powers. You have checks and balances, right? This is what makes the Constitution great, so to speak. Well, unfortunately, the Constitution actually reduced checks and balances because the true checks and balances, the true separation of powers, true federalism is a balance of power between the federal government and the states. Okay, what the Constitution did is it weakened the states, and it said, well, the federal government's just going to police itself, basically, in so many words. Okay, and this is a problem because what's happened over time is that the state governments have just lost power steadily against the power of the federal government, right? What stops the three branches from working together to increase their power, right? President gets to do his thing, Congress gets to pass laws, Supreme Court gets to rule on cases and kind of, talk about all sorts of legal issues and things like that, and then they all kind of hold hands and merrily the power of the government goes up, right? And this is almost what's happened. It's pretty much what's happened over the past 200 years or so, right? Now, let's look at what Rothbard has to say about the separation of powers in reality, right? So what Rothbard says is that, he says, quote, if the ultimate power to interpret the Constitution is given to the government's own Supreme Court, right, which is true, then the inevitable tendency is for the court to continue to place its imprimatur, its stamp of approval on ever broader powers for its own government. And this is exactly what's happened. The Supreme Court generally approves government power. Yes, it sometimes weakens it, or it says the president can't do this, or Congress, mostly on technicalities, basically saying, well, you can't do it through this means, you got to do it through some other way. But the Supreme Court has basically strengthened the federal government's power. All right? Rothbard continues. He says, furthermore, the highly touted checks and balances and separation of powers in the American government are flimsy indeed, since in the final analysis, all of these divisions are part of the same government and are governed by the same set of rulers. Right? He wrote this in For New Liberty. And his argument is that basically, again, who's actually checking the federal government from itself? What's to prevent the federal government from colluding? All of the politicians, the president, the Supreme Court, and so on. This is the so-called deep state that a lot of people are upset about today. The essence of it is built into the Constitution. It hurts me to say it. Okay. All right, so much for the separation of powers. But what about what the Constitution says the government can and can't do? All right. This brings us to the elastic Constitution. All right. So the Constitution has 7 articles, right? Article 1's about Congress, Article 2 is about the president, Article 3 is about the judiciary, kind of goes on further after that. Article 4 on state regulations, Article 5 on the amendment process, Article 6 on the supremacy of the federal government, and Article 7 on ratification. The first 3 articles are the biggest on Congress, on the president, on the judiciary, basically saying how they operate, what they can do, and what they can't do, right? The most important parts of the Constitution are the what I like to call the big 3 vague clauses. This is really where all of the dirty work is accomplished, okay? The clauses I'm referring to are the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. The General Welfare Clause is in Article 1, Section 8. It says, the Congress shall have power to
and it lists some things that Congress can do. But then it also says, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. All right, and this has been used to basically say, well, this is in support of, this benefits the general welfare, so this is government intervention X is constitutional. The necessary and proper clause from Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. And this has been used by various advocates of a stronger government, saying, well, this is necessary and proper, right? This government intervention, right? And then you have the supremacy clause from Article 6, where it says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Basically saying it takes supremacy over any sort of state laws and regulations and so on. We're the boss, basically. That's what the supremacy clause says. All right. So here's the kicker. The kicker is that the Federalists at the Constitution, and they often said as much, as we'll see, they knew that these clauses could always perform the heavy lifting and do the dirty work. It's true that Section 8 of Article 1, when it talks about what Congress can do, it can say, well, Congress can do these certain things, and it lists it out. But that's only just some of the powers, according to the Federalists. Right? Basically, they can do everything else, because as long as it fits with general welfare or necessary and proper or supremacy, the supremacy clause, then, well, it's constitutional. Okay. The relatively limited enumeration of powers was designed to minimize controversy during ratification, right? The Federalists knew that if they explicitly put in the Constitution that Congress has the power to charter a central bank, right, then the Constitution would not have been ratified, right? But they're sneaky. They in a sense, they lied. Okay, because they say, well, you got to have a central bank, it benefits the public, and it's necessary and proper, right? So let's go through a couple of examples of how the Federalists knew what they were doing. The Constitution says that Congress doesn't explicitly have the power to print money. It only has the power to coin money, right? But Gouverneur Morris at the convention said that this just restricted issuance to a responsible minister. Okay, well, again, it's just, we have the power to do this as long as it benefits the public, right? Sort of the general welfare. It just, again, this is how they can get around it. Those clauses can do the dirty work. Congress also doesn't have the explicit power to charter a corporation like a central bank. But Gouverneur Morris, again, said that the general welfare clause authorized granting, quote, exclusive privileges to trading companies, right, such as the central bank and other types of corporations. And again, the idea is that, well, it's these vague clauses. They can perform the dirty work, so to speak, right? The relatively limited enumeration of powers was not all that the Federalists intended. They were just trying to sell the document to the people, okay? That's very important. And the Anti-Federalists recognized this, which is why they were very worried about these clauses, right? Okay. So here's the uphill battle, because the Constitution that, say, we might like or we might, we know and love is what's known as strict constructionism, or it takes, the constitutionalists are strict constructionists. We take a very, people try to take a very literal definition of what the Constitution says, where we say that, well, the founding fathers intended for something to be this way. We might look at the Federalist Papers and say something James Madison or Alexander Hamilton said. The Federalist Papers have all sorts of problems, and they basically were written as propaganda pieces. But I think Rothbard has a great sort of response to the strict constructionism. So he says this in Conceived in Liberty. He says, the libertarians, quote, relying on the Bill of Rights and the 10th Amendment, right, all powers not delegated to the government, or that's the reserved for the states, right? The Bill of Rights, the various 10 amendments, that's a whole conversation in itself. So libertarians would go forth and do battle for liberty and against power within the framework of the American Constitution as states' writers and constitutionalists. Right? And we know of these groups, so we could have the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Jacksonian Democrats or the Cleveland Democrats and so on and so forth. We can go to more modern people, my hero, Ron Paul, and so on, really advocating that the government cannot do certain things according to the Constitution. Rothbard praises their efforts. He says their battle would be a long and gallant one, but ultimately doomed to fail. Ultimately doomed to fail. For by accepting the Constitution, they would only play with dice loaded implacably against them. You're basically playing a rigged game. It's like you're playing with a rigged deck, right? Because even though you might be able to score some victories with this interpretation of the Constitution, and important victories, were scored, no doubt. Unfortunately, it's those vague clauses and other features that just means the general trend of government intervention is going to go up under this document. And that's exactly what's happened, right? We've seen this so much when I showed the graph yesterday of government spending as a percent of GDP, right? The trend is just up, okay? Though they could and did run a gallant race, they were doomed to lose, and lose indeed they did. Right? So strict constructionism is a great strategy. The anti-federalists were the ones who came up with this after they realized they lost. Right? But it can only go so far, right? And this is Rothbard's main point, and I just think it bears emphasis because I think that's what the history has borne out, unfortunately. I really do wish it were otherwise. Okay, so we had step 3, the final step, which was to use Constitution to get cronyism, and I want to talk about some of the cronyism that was actually enacted in the 1790s, okay? So there were various interest groups that wanted special privileges that supported the Constitution. We've gone through a couple of them recently, briefly. Public debt speculators, these people had bought government debt at very low values, and the idea was they wanted the government to raise taxes to pay off that debt. You had bankers and financiers. They wanted a central bank to subsidize the banking system. You had manufacturers. They wanted the government to pass tariffs, right, and other types of privileges, maybe subsidies. Land speculators, they wanted the government to strengthen the claims of that land companies had gotten from state governments, and so on. You had merchants that wanted a strong military to basically open up various ports around the world. So particularly the Caribbean, you basically have the United States Army sort of force trading relations upon other countries. And this is more or less the history of the United States in the 1800s, 1900s. So the general theme in the 1790s was kind of like Oprah, like you get a bank bailout, or you get higher tariffs or something like that, right? All the special interests more or less got what they wanted. It wasn't perfect, but they were able to get a good amount of what they wanted, and it was through the people who created the Constitution. Okay, so let's just go through a couple of these. So the first thing is that Congress assumed the public debt. Right? One of the most important players in the government in the 1790s was Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Right? And one of the first things he did was he wrote a report relative to a provision for the support of public credit. The new government was created in March of 1789. Alexander Hamilton, he becomes Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the year. And one of the first things he does is, the new year, 1790, he issues this report and he gives it to Congress. And the basic thrust was that Congress should assume about $80 million of Confederate and state debts that were contracted during the Revolutionary War. And the argument is that, these government obligations were given to soldiers and farmers and other patriotic citizens of the Revolutionary War because Congress didn't have any money, and, we can't break our promise, okay? The reality, though, is that those farmers and soldiers, they needed the money then, so they sold them. And who did they sell them to? Well, they sold them to speculators, guys like Robert Morris and other individuals who bought them on the cheap. These were highly speculative investments. Right? The Articles of Confederation, the government did not have taxing power. And what do they want? Well, they want Congress to raise taxes to pay off that debt at face value so they could make a killing, right? And that's exactly what they did. The Funding Act of 1790 led to windfall profits of wealthy elites, right? And again, it was mostly held by elites. About 80% of Confederate debt was held by wealthy northern speculators from northern states. And this is similar for state debts, at least from the evidence we have. And in about 1795, 5% of debt holders owned about 65% of the federal debt. Right, so it was really concentrated among a small group of individuals. Senator Robert Morris, Senator of Pennsylvania, and also Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, William Duer, sort of Hamilton's right-hand man. He's speculating in this stuff. And yeah, they make lots of money. This is sort of the first instance of really big cronyism. It enriched a lot of people, all right? So let's just continue on with the list. Well, what's the next thing Congress does? It charters a central bank. And many of you might know this story. Right after writing his report on the public credit, Hamilton writes a report on a national bank, and this was released in December 1790. Right? He's advocating, well, our government, in order for it to function, we need a central bank to help with payments, to provide credit to businesses and the government, et cetera, et cetera. And one small detail I love is that this was referred to a Senate committee, which Senator Robert Morris had sat on, right? And it was a 5-man committee, and he had been advocating a central bank for the longest time. So he happily receives this report, and it's reported, a bill establishing a central bank is reported out of committee. This is often how things work in Congress. The people in charge of committees are either special interests themselves or they are beholden to various special interests. Okay. And again, I could spend a whole lecture on the Bank of the United States, but all I'll say here is that Congress chartered the Bank of the United States in 1791. There was this big debate, but the debate was settled in favor of the bank, and Congress chartered the bank. And just an interesting little element of cronyism there. 50% of congressmen who voted for the bank purchased stock in the bank, right? So basically, they were expecting to benefit. This was a private corporation. About 1/5 was owned by the government. And as for the other 80% of the ownership, well, politicians said, yeah, I'll buy that stock. And they made money, right? This is a little bit of insider kind of insider dealings, so to speak. Another thing that I think is just fascinating is that Thomas Willing, who was Robert Morris's business associate, became president of this bank. Again, it's like, okay, this is like a really sort of like, why are these people like, how are they doing this? The Hamilton is really just, Hamilton and the Federalists. It's pretty crony, I would argue. Okay. Continuing on here, Congress raises tariffs. Hamilton wrote a report called Report on Manufactures, came out in December 1791. And Hamilton, in this report, he praised subsidies and protective tariffs. Now, some people have jumped on this because there's this, I would argue, sort of this weird group of libertarians who say that, well, Hamilton was a free market guy. And I can't explain it, to be honest with you, but these people exist, and they say, well, Hamilton didn't favor super protective tariffs. He might have favored tariffs for revenue, or that he was pro free market, so that's why we needed a central bank or stuff that the logic doesn't really hold. It is true that Hamilton favored subsidies more than protective tariffs, but he still thought protective tariffs could do a lot because he was anti-Adam Smith. He was pro John Baptiste Colbert, who was a famous mercantilist theoretician. So he didn't get the subsidies. There was a big battle in Congress over that for a variety of reasons. But the tariff of 1792 did institute protective tariffs. And this was under the guise of Congress needing to raise revenue to fight Indians in the West, or what was Ohio, Western Pennsylvania at the time. And Hamilton was able to get Congress to raise tariffs that were pretty much protective in nature. They provided a privilege to domestic producers. And tariffs increased from about 12.5% in 1789 to about 30% by 1800. So the Federalists kept raising tariffs, right? So clearly, the new Constitution facilitated higher taxes on foreign goods, and this led to various distortions and other sorts of problems that we discussed before. Okay. So let's want to make sure we have enough time to cover things. So I want to talk about how Congress strengthened the military using the new Constitution. So a lot of Americans, rightfully so, were afraid or they were worried about the military. They were worried about a standing army. This was a healthy fear because they had to experience this for periods of time when they were colonies, right? With Great Britain, they would have a standing army, and this army would be used to enforce taxes, to put down dissent, and so on. This was linking together basically the sword and the purse, right? So the ability to raise money, and you have a strong military to back it up. Okay, Congress had the power to raise an army, right? And the president could command that power, could command that army. And the federal government, they did raise an army in the 1790s, right? So a lot of times people think that, well, an army, strong army or strong navy would benefit the public. It's helpful for national defense and all that stuff. Well, it also benefits various interests, okay? Various special interests. A stronger army and a stronger navy benefits militarists, right, with powerful positions, right? They get to wear some cool outfits. They get to be a general, or they could get a nice pension from the government, in return for their military service. And it also subsidizes merchants with taxpayer protection. Why? Because a lot of times merchants back in those days, dealing in various types of speculative activity or buying and selling goods from around the world, it could be risky. You could get into various disagreements with your trading partners, or maybe you would have to deal with pirates. That was an issue. And on the free market, you would invest in your own protection. And this is what often merchants had to do. But what they also wanted is they wanted the government to basically provide them protection. Right? They wanted the government to provide them with, have a strong navy in the ocean, to have troops in the western frontier when you're dealing with Spain and the Mississippi River, so on and so forth. Okay, and this is why a lot of times United States foreign interventions are supported by various business interests because they can benefit from the strong military and the strong navy. So from about 1795 to 1800, so at kind of the end of the Washington administration and then during the John Adams administration, the second president of the United States, Congress increased appropriations for the Departments of War and Navy by about 108%. Okay, the Department of War was one of the first departments created. It was created about 1789, and this is the Department of Defense now, but back then we were more honest with our titles because it's the Department of War. What's their job? It's their job to make war. Right now we say that, well, the job of the Department of Defense is to defend us, right? It's a sleight of hand, but it's important. But Department of War, far more accurate. Department of the Navy was created in the late 1790s, and northern merchants really wanted a Department of the Navy because they said, well, we need American ships in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic. They need to protect us. And a lot of southern planters were against this because they said, well, couldn't you buy insurance? Couldn't you couldn't you have your own protection on your ships or and so on and so forth? But anyway, they lost that battle. So military spending sharply increased in the 1790s. Now, a very important thing that I think often gets neglected is that the Army de facto was led by Inspector General Alexander Hamilton. So a lot of people, they don't realize that after becoming Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton had he was in the military. This is not discussed in the play at all, right? But Alexander Hamilton wanted to sort of secretly become kind of the ruling general. George Washington kind of came out of retirement and was nominally the general, but he said, I'd only take command if a nation invaded us like France, which we had a lot of difficulties with in the late 1790s. But Hamilton was sort of de facto in charge. He was second in command, right? And Hamilton was working with various New England merchants, the Essex Junto, who wanted to use the military to control shipping in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Western Hemisphere. So they said, look, America needs to become a power like Great Britain, an imperial power. This is an old form of, say, imperialism, right? We need our own colonies in the Caribbean or in South America. We need to force these countries to trade with us. They need to supply us raw materials, and we need to sell them manufactured goods, right? Basically the exact same relationship that we had with Great Britain, right? So to just go through a couple of quotes. As early as July 1797, a Federalist writer wrote basically a newspaper back in the day, wrote that both France and Spain had to be, quote, driven into the Gulf of Mexico. They had to be kicked out of the North American continent, end quote, and the wealth gained from this plundering would, quote, be the cream of the war. So we basically need to have some sort of war, and we need to kick them out, and then we'll be able to have access to all of their markets. According to another Federalist, a New England merchant, the United States, quote, should enjoy exclusively the commerce of all Americas, North and South America, and Africa, and the best part of Asia and Europe. So pretty much the world, right? And you had a Gazette of the United States, which is a Federalist periodical, and it demanded war against France and Spain, and it sort of belligerently proclaimed, quote, it is in vain to disguise the truth that America is essentially and naturally a commercial nation, and that from her location on the map of the world, she must ever remain so. It ought therefore to be the undeviating care of the government to procure admission to our flag in ports whence it is now excluded, right? You got to trade with America, whether you like it or not, to obtain it by right where it now rests on the ground of sufferance and to establish it on a regular and permanent footing. Basically saying the military has to subsidize our commerce, and we have to make sure other countries around the world are going to trade with us, whether they like it or not. And if you know the history of U.S. imperialism and how we basically forced open markets in Japan and China and South America, this all comes from sort of the proponents of the Constitution, the Federalists. Okay, Hamilton eagerly looked forward to participating in this. These are quotes from Hamilton, by the way. He said, when it came to South America and, quote, the riches of Mexico and Peru, end quote, he said, frankly, the command in this case would very naturally fall upon me. He could lead the army, right? He would be the one to sort of lead the United States into glorious battle, so to speak. And I love this quote. This comes from one of the Essex Junto members. Quote, wage war and call it self-defense. Tell the citizens of danger and bring them to war gradually. Right? It's more or less the playbook of, you could say, the Department of Defense. Okay, so as we can see, the Constitution benefited various special interests, right? It benefited bankers, it benefited manufacturers, it benefited merchants, and so on. And this was the intention. It wasn't really a perversion of the Constitution. It was what the original founding fathers had intended. This is why Rothbard took a very negative view of the Constitution, okay? So, in conclusion, I want to say, the Constitution is not libertarian. I wish it were so. You could have a strategic interpretation of it that makes it libertarian, but it's not the essence of the Constitution, and it's not going to work in the long run, because the reality is the Constitution was designed to be crony, right? And it has facilitated cronyism. Okay, this is the rationale of the Constitution. When people are upset at the size of the federal government now, and they say, well, how could this government get so big? How could this happen under the Constitution? I'm not, of course, saying like the Federalists had predicted all this stuff, but they had designed a government that could basically provide cronyism to various elites and increase their power when necessary, Okay, so I would say for more, you could read Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, the long lost 5th volume that came out in 2019. You could also read my own book, Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America. So I'm going to end right here, but before I end, I have an announcement that I was told to make. And the announcement is this, so sort of, I guess, maybe like a real life application of interventionism or cronyism. So we have the thank you note workshop right now, where you won't be able to leave. We're going to be handing out the thank you notes, and we'd really appreciate it for you to express to the donors who are making this event possible just how important this week has been, what you've learned, and this would just really matter. This would really make a great impact. Keeps this event going. And so with that, I will end. Thank you so much.